Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. I've been doing this podcast for about 8 years now, most of the Trump era, and throughout that time I've used it to bring a whole variety of ideas and perspectives to the audience. I've also had a political project of my own. I've had my own point of view on what is happening. Specifically, I've long argued that Trump, figures like him, and the movements they represent really are an existential threat to liberal democracy. And on the other, I've argued for a more robust response to them from mainline liberal parties and institutions. Specifically, I want a liberalism that is more assertive, that more clearly argues its own values, that doesn't blame itself or portray fascism as a reaction to its misdeeds, and perhaps most importantly, doesn't feel that the way to stave off this threat is by preemptively giving ground. Throwing vulnerable people under the bus, hoping for a compromise with fascism that I think just isn't possible. In that vein, I recently wrote an article in the New Republic critiquing a certain style of liberalism called either neutral or political liberalism associated with John Rawls, in which the goal of the ideology is to be something of a political referee, adjudicating between different comprehensive worldviews, rather than in the fray itself. In contrast, I argued liberalism is now a player in a fight that it can lose, and a great deal depends on it not doing so. And in contrast, championed a version of liberalism, sometimes called comprehensive liberalism, meaning a liberalism based in an argument about what is good for people and what a good life is. In response to that, a few people said they'd like to hear me defend that position against a critic of it, against someone who, even if they agree that there are challenges with neutral political liberalism, has concerns about my preferred alternative on both a philosophical and a practical level. This is what that conversation is. My guest today is Alec Crisman, who's been recently writing on exactly this topic, the tension between political and comprehensive liberalism. We hold, as you will see, contrasting views of what liberalism is, and I think this was a really, really interesting and valuable discussion, forcing us to both get into it on what we think and why. It's a long conversation, one I've decided to only very, very lightly edit. I, when I have different views to a guest, I'm probably a poor judge on what they felt was most important that they said. And also, I just want you to be able to hear it as a real conversation. I think these things are quite fun and I like doing them, and I think they're useful. I think doing this has put a bunch of thoughts in my head for how I can phrase stuff differently and think through stuff differently and present my ideas in a better way. I think I found it a useful exercise. I'd say there's 3 parts to this conversation, each probably about an hour. The first part is Alec presents challenges to me of my view, why he doesn't think my preferred vision of liberalism is the answer in this moment. The next part is about where liberalism goes from here. This is where I got the title from, Should Liberalism Fight or Retreat and Retrench? With me arguing that I want a liberalism that fights, and I think most liberals want a liberalism that fights, and Alec arguing that, in the US case at least, what we may need to accept is a much more limited stalemate in which there's red states and blue states each doing their own thing, and that is kind of the destination we should try and navigate ourselves towards. I'm almost certainly simplifying the argument in that title, as one must. As you'll hear, Alec does think there is some room for fighting, and I'm not in all cases ruling out compromise. But I think, as you'll hear, we have pretty different views as to what the correct strategy here is, or what a desirable outcome would look like. And then in the final part, we both sort of reflect back on the conversation and think about what are what are the core areas in which we diverge, but also what our agreements are. What can we agree together against what we both feel is the least desirable outcome, which is a full authoritarian takeover. So that's the conversation. I won't preamble it any more than that. As I say, this is a long one. So let's get straight into it, apart from, as always, to say very, very briefly, if you like the show and if you appreciate my work, if you either agree with the political project I've outlined and I'm trying to bring on this, or you think it's interestingly and perhaps informatively wrong, um, then consider supporting on Patreon. You can do so easily and for any amount. That's just patreon.com/political philosophy podcast, patreon.com/political philosophy podcast. Yeah, I did want to give that introduction just because this is quite a long and in-depth episode. We're both working through our views in real time here, but I enjoyed doing this, and I hope you think it's something interesting to listen to. So, this is Should Liberalism Fight or Retreat and Retrench with Alec Crisman. I am joined today by Alec Crisman. Alec, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
I am very, very happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Toby.
So, this conversation was suggested by friend of the podcast, previous guest, and I believe your dissertation advisor, Jacob Levy.
Yes, indeed. He put up the bat signal for anybody who was willing to defend something like neutralist liberalism, and so I apparently swooped in. I'm not on Blue Sky very much, so it did catch me a little off guard, but I'm very, very happy to be here. And he's big, big intellectual influence on me, obviously.
Yeah, no, he's great, and he's. I mean, you talk about Blue Sky. He's a good follow on Blue Sky. His
Very
sort of
much so.
day-to-day commentary of US political politics, I think, finds that sweet spot I think a lot of academics struggle with, which is both drawing on his intellectual knowledge, but just clear for anyone to follow, but also morally forceful. I think a lot of
Yeah,
academics, when they do political commentary, can kind of get, well, it's nuanced and it's complicated and but this, but that. I
yeah,
think Jacob has a good way of being, it's this, you know?
yes. And not to glaze the host too much, but it reminded me of your piece in the New Republic, which we're going to talk about. A very kind of similar attitude of this is theoretically informed, but we care about how things work in the real world. We care about how politics actually works. We care about political philosophy on this podcast, obviously, but we care about how it exists in the real world, not necessarily zooming in on the details of any one particular thinker. So, no, this was a match made in heaven in a lot of ways. I'm really, really glad. And no, he also really influenced that in my work, my writing as well. Yeah, can't recommend him highly enough. If you build a whole following on Twitter, then Twitter gets destroyed and you follow and you do it again on Blue Sky from scratch, that's pretty good. You know he's actually worth listening to.
Yeah, for a lot of us, the switch over
The
to Blue
refugees.
Sky was smoother than we thought it would be.
Hmm.
I'll put it that way. But anyway, yeah, thank you for that. And following from that, we're doing political and comprehensive liberalism today.
Yes.
Let's so in my article, The New Republic, when you mentioned, I called it neutral liberalism, but I think we're
Mhm.
clearly referencing this just because I thought that gave people a bit of a who aren't up on these debates a bit of a
Yep.
clearer sense of what I'm talking about. But we can use either term. What
Hmm.
is political and comprehensive liberalism? Let me just ask you that to start, in the simplest possible terms.
Yeah, in the broadest strokes, I did just finish my dissertation on this, and after a couple months of distance, the details can fade. But as I taught it in my intro class, what political liberalism begins with is the idea that there are reasonable comprehensive doctrines, that people are going to disagree on fundamental moral and political issues, and they're going to do so in such a way and with such a kind of repetitive character, like it's not going to go away.
Hmm.
And Rawls thinks we really need to take this as a ground level element of our theorization. This kind of approach is heavily concerned with dealing with diversity, particularly ideological diversity. Disagreement is just going to be part of politics. How does one do politics if that is one of your core assumptions? Rawls builds this on his earlier liberalism, the liberalism some maybe some people who've listened to this podcast are a bit more familiar with, the liberalism of the original position, the liberalism of his theory of justice, his first book, that has a much more clear kind of moral story for what it takes to live a good life. This is what it takes to live a good life. This is the theory of justice that people should all be able to assent to if we think through it rationally, through the original position, et cetera, et cetera. We can get into that if you want to. But then he sort of looked at that and he went, no, that's kind of too small. I need to deal with the fact that there are wide ranging, he lists some, Catholicism is one of his core examples that he brings up of a comprehensive doctrine, a reasonable comprehensive doctrine. But one of the things that's interesting about this political liberalism, which really does, I thought your summary in the article was pretty good. It does see itself as the referee managing the rules of the game of ideological conflict in a diverse society. And the way that ideological conflict and conflict around justice, he wouldn't use the word ideology necessarily, but the way that ideological conflict about beliefs, conflicts about beliefs about justice inform politics. What's weird about this system is there's a comprehensive doctrine of liberalism. He identifies it, which he calls it comprehensive liberalism. And comprehensive liberalism is a comprehensive notion of the good. It's an idea that there is a kind of good that at least most, if not all, lives should strive towards. And for comprehensive Catholicism, this is going to be something like communion with God in the right way. That's what life is all about. For comprehensive liberalism, it's autonomy. It's creating the conditions for people to maximize their autonomy because autonomy is the necessary precondition for human flourishing. You bring up Mill endlessly in the article. He is the comprehensive liberal par excellence, John Stuart Mill. He has this idea comprehensive liberalism is very tied into education. It's very tied into the notion of self-development and self-cultivation. Cultivation is the right metaphor. You cite a great quote, the idea that a person is like a tree. It needs to be able to grow and branch out in different directions. That task of cultivation is the purpose of the good life for the comprehensive liberal. And as such, I think comprehensive liberalism is kind of a lot easier for people to sort of emotionally lock onto than political liberalism. There are very few felt deep in their gut political or neutralist liberals. People understand, if you ask them, the purpose, the point, the value of having a neutral set of rules that can govern a wide, diverse society. But what they feel, what I think most liberals feel in their gut, is I believe in maximizing people's autonomy. I believe in maximizing the space for people to form their own lives and make their own decisions about themselves as individuals. Comprehensive liberalism is also very, very heavily focused on the individual. Political liberalism can kind of angle you towards group concerns in a lot of ways, intermediate groups, social groups, ideological groups, religious groups. So that's a first kind of stab at the big contrasting views. And the awkward thing about it is, which I get into in the paper, which we might talk about, is that political liberalism is refereeing a game in which one of the participants is a form of liberalism. And
Hmm.
this can lead to some problems, I argue.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. Yeah, I use just as a way of people getting their head into the game. the referee metaphor. It's maybe not
Hmm.
exact. Some people called me out on that. Is that exactly what Rawls is saying? And I don't know. It's a metaphor that powerful people themselves use.
Yeah.
So John Roberts, famously, who isn't a liberal, but this is a sort of
Yeah.
he's referencing that sort of understanding in his confirmation hearing. Says my role is to call balls and strikes. So he's
Yes.
explicitly conceptualizing himself as some sort of referee or umpire. But then, of course, liberalism is also a player in the game. And I
Yep.
guess my point is we are now just a player. There is
Yeah.
no referee in contemporary American politics, but these sorts of divides are increasingly global as well.
Mm.
There is there is no longer enough of a consensus that the position of referee even makes sense as a thing
Hmm.
to think about. And my view is it was always a bit philosophically confused to
Hmm.
begin with, but it no longer makes any sense anymore. We are just a player, and we need to play and we need to win, and trying to dual brain ourselves that we also see ourselves as a
Yeah.
referee is only going to hold us back. I guess
It's a
in
very demanding. Dual brain's a really good way to put it. I write in the dissertation. It's a really demanding kind of like double consciousness. Like here I am, the liberal who wants to engage in this project in the world, but I'm also the political liberal who understands that I can't, like you say very well, you paraphrasing Robert Frost, I can't take my own side in the I can't take my own side of the argument. And you're ready for liberals to take their own side in the argument. I really get that. I have a lot of sympathy for that. There's this great bit. It was a guy on Twitter. I need to track down the ultimate source of this, but political theorists pour over John Rawls anecdotes like hadiths, right? Like you got to really
yeah.
pick at them. And this guy had a seminar with John Rawls, and he asked John Rawls, right before his death, right around, what do you think the odds are of setting up a successful overlapping consensus in the United States? And Rawls said
Absolutely.
about 1 in 1,000.
Yes, although, you know, I'm always much more interested in talking about ideas as they exist and are practiced and
Yep.
the work that has been done with them rather than sort of what strict authorial intent is. Rules, I think, like a lot of thinkers, and sort of everyone will say this of their famous philosopher, is better than his interpreters in
Yep.
a lot of ways. And someone else said absolutely put in that camp would be Isaiah Berlin.
Yeah.
Uh,
Exactly.
you know, in to me, the positive negative distinction is really ground zero. This isn't what we're going to talk about, but just as an
No.
example, the positive negative distinction for me really is like the fons et origo of everything wrong with how we think and talk about freedom. And I think he's just like an initial bad move on which so many future bad moves are built.
Hmm.
And I just get sort of both exasperated and a little bored reading a lot of philosophy that follows from that.
Yeah.
And yet, when you read Isaiah Berlin himself, I still don't ultimately agree with him, but he's so much more nuanced and such a better writer than
Yes.
like so many of the, you read the primary sources, people,
Hmm. Of course.
and I think Rawls is true of that, but like, I don't view it as my role to be a sort of crusader for a particular philosopher and say, no, you've got
No.
to understand the original Rawls was like so much more nuanced. And he was, sure, but
Yeah.
I care what's happened with the tradition and the work the ideas have done in the world, whether that's fair to Rawls himself.
And that's kind of interesting you
Whether
say
the
that though,
other-
because like you felt like a crusader for Mill in that article that you wrote. Like it seems like you're Mr. John Stuart Mill, at least right now, at least at this stage of your kind of political growth. Forgive me for interviewing the interviewer, but like at least
That's a
I,
good
I I
challenge.
I was excited about that. Like I love somebody who takes up who takes up a worldview that has concrete implications for how politics should be done right now and wants to call back. And one of the things that I think is going to happen in this conversation is, you say we need to throw John Rawls under the bus. I have a 300-page dissertation agreeing with you.
Hmm.
The issue is we got to throw Mill under the bus too.
Okay.
Political liberalism is not suited for the current political moment, but neither is comprehensive liberalism, especially not Mill's comprehensive liberalism.
Okay, let's get
There's
to
a
that.
first point of conversa of contention, perhaps.
Um, Definitely. It's a good challenge to me of like if I'm saying I'm not especially interested in redeeming a particular philosopher, am I not doing that with Mill? Maybe to a degree. I like Mill because I think he's a good stand-in for a way of thinking about politics that I would advocate. As you said earlier, I think he's kind of the comprehensive liberal par excellence in that his thinking is very clearly grounded in public good. With that said, there's certain arguments and, yeah, like I say, just ways of thinking politically that I would want to resurrect from Mill. Not even resurrect, I argue they never really went away. I think that's actually
Yeah,
how
exactly.
most liberals think about politics most of the
Hmm.
time.
I
I
agree.
think there can be an instinct among the sort of professional political thinkers class to see that as less sophisticated somehow. Yes, that's people's gut instinct, but a more philosophically sound approach, a more scalable approach, a more justifiable approach is this neutral one. And I think my perspective is there's no tension there. The
Hmm.
comprehensive approach is both more philosophically sound and more persuasive and more suited to the moment. And so
Hmm.
those things don't necessarily have to run together, but in this
Hmm.
moment they are, which is why I put a bit of weight behind defending them. Now, I don't see that necessarily as defending Mill as a person.
Well,
To,
you
to
wouldn't want to defend everything about Mill, yeah.
well, yeah, I mean, Mill worked for the East India Trading Company, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you want to pick, if you want to pick things that are not really defensible about Mill, there's more with Mill than there is with Rawls, right?
Hmm.
You know, I think, there's a sort of Charles Mills critique that Rawls doesn't sufficiently factor in issues like enduring racism, and fine,
Yes,
that's a
indeed.
good critique.
Yeah.
Mill, again, worked for the East India Trading
Yeah.
Company,
He
right?
was the
So,
active advocate of imperial domination. That's not what you're doing. That's not what you're saying.
yeah.
That is not. What I would argue though is there are aspects of Mill's thinking that you are drawing upon that are the font for those kinds of, let's be very generous and call them mistakes in Mill. You know, if you've read Jacob Levy's book, Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom,
Mhm.
he also takes up Mill as the comprehensive liberal par excellence. And one of the points that he makes, which I think leads to one of the questions I had reading your article, or one of the problems I had reading your article, was Mill has a very demanding notion of what it is to be a full, flourishing individual.
Mhm.
It is such a demanding notion. The kind of shorthand I like to use for this is I'm Basque ethnically.
Right.
And Mill in conversation on representative government, something like that, representative government. He talks about, he's got the line about how basically Basques are so backwards that they would be better off being conquered by the French and being brought into the French civilization as French
Mhm.
people. Best to leave their ethnic heritage behind. Um, if you have such a strict notion of the person that you are getting bigoted against my particular ethnic group, my very niche ethnic group,
Yeah.
if you're that detailed, this is not just a Mill was racist gotcha. This is looking at him going, no, he's got a very specific notion of what it means to be a full, flourishing individual. And that specific notion looks a lot like a Victorian educated gentleman in the 1800s.
Mhm.
That's how he sees it. It's heavily based on education. You know, the other big example with Mill you get in considerations on representative government is he wants to give people who have more education multiple votes. Another big factor of his
Mhm.
worldview. And this comes from, I think, a source which is something that you do that is a problem for the way that you take up Mill, which is this very demanding notion of the person. I do think it's more popular than neutralist liberalism. I do think neutralist liberalism does have the double mind problem that you talk about. But I think comprehensive liberalism, especially Mill's comprehensive liberalism, especially a comprehensive liberalism grounded in this aspect of Mill, autonomy is not particularly popular. Autonomy broadly, it's popular among liberals. It's more popular among liberals than neutralist liberalism is, than political liberalism is. But among the broad population, there's this great show. Have you watched the show Fleabag at all?
Yeah.
In season 2 of Fleabag, very famous scene, she's breaking down in front of the very famous hot priest, important
Hmm.
character for this fandom. And she has a breakdown where she goes, "Please just tell me what to do. I've been trying all these different ways of living an autonomous life, and I've really made a mess of it. Please just tell me what to do."
Mm.
And I think that impulse is ultimately stronger across the population. The desire to be told what to do, the desire to pick an identity or an ideology off the shelf, that high demand of engage in your autonomous self process, engage in this thick, rich process of self creation. I believe Mill formulated in an elite ideology because I think that can only really be an elite ideology functionally. I think it is currently tied to university education. You find people tend to like autonomy and autonomy producing positions more the more they've been educated. The majority of Americans still don't go to university. That's one big problem. So, do I want to just say Mill bad racist? No. What I do want to say is Mill's exclusionary conception and limited conception of what creates a full individual person, what makes a person a full individual, that puts a hard cap on how successful his worldview and his approach can be as a basis for a successful mass politics. That was a big theoretical but practical question I had while I was reading your full-throated advocacy forum, or what I read as your full-throated advocacy forum.
All for that style of thinking.
Yeah,
And so you put a lot on the table there. Let me pick up at least a
please.
few of those points. Firstly, with Mill, I mean, Mill is a Victorian gentleman, right? Just to address historical context a little, in both a positive and a negative sense. So, in a positive sense, um, one of the one of his autobiographies starts this way. Events for him as a young man was finding a dead child in the road that had been
Mhm.
abandoned from exposure. And this led to him to get super into advocating more universal access to contraception, which at the time was
Mhm.
like a huge scandal. And like, you're not allowed to say that. But
Yep.
that's, in a sense, is quite Victorian, lapel-wearing, crusading liberalism in a way that is outdated, but is admirable in some
Yeah.
sense, I think. He's also there are many ideas he's absorbed. There's a romantic notion in the air of his writing about sort of like the
Mhm.
character of races, the character of peoples. And they
Yes.
perhaps don't mean it in an absolute biologically determinist sense, although they perhaps
Mhm.
don't even make this separation of like people are intrinsically this, but they do feel like there is such a thing as the French character, or to use your example, the Basque character.
Yeah.
And they'll often talk about particular races being weak or
Yeah.
these people just have a fighting spirit or in a way that sounds
Yeah.
preposterous
A
to
taxonomizing approach to the world that
yeah.
actually isn't that far off from how a lot of people talk about politics now. Like people love categories. People love putting people into category. Like I see a lot of what you're saying in terms of I do think there is a lot to pick up there that isn't always intrinsically bad, even though of course formulated it was in the 1800s. There's
I
going to
mean,
be some
if you want
nasty
to
stuff
go
in there.
to another bad bit about Mill, you're also just getting into the age where I guess you could say like proto-eugenicist ideas are getting
Yeah.
going, or like the antecedents of
Mhm.
eugenicists are coming up. And eugenicists was something in which liberals more than dabbled through
Yep.
all the way up until the
100%.
Second World War.
The
And
big
Mill,
progressive sin.
because it's still, like I say, in its antecedent stage, it's hard to sort of connect Mill with that tradition, but he does occasionally say stuff that sounds very fucking eugenicist
Yeah.
to our ears. I don't
100%.
know how far I implicate him, but like he does occasionally talk about like letting the weaker members of the race die off. So there's all that, you know. Like I say, if you want to go through for like problematic stuff
Yeah.
in Mill, way worse than Rawls. I think perhaps
Yeah.
merely that's judging them if by putting them standing next to each other. If you judge them by where they stood relative to the rest of their society at the
Mhm.
time. then I think a more charitable view of Mill emerges.
Yeah, though I do want to point out one other thing with that Professor Levy points out, which is, you have right at the same time, it's a really interesting parallel that he draws. Now, he doesn't divide liberalism up into, political and comprehensive. He thinks rationalist versus pluralist is the more interesting. The rationalists kind of believe in, a top-down
Although that's
approach.
that's pulling us to one side. Let me maybe get
Yes.
into, because that was just my historical context.
Oh, exactly. Please go ahead.
Yeah, let me get into maybe some of the more substantive. So I think the central concern with Mill, and it's the correct one. So I don't think, for instance, like a paternalist critique of the liberty principle really is very good or carries a lot of weight. I think the good critique of Mill is this is a very demanding notion, and
Mhm.
is this something that's going to be accessible and available to everyone? I think you start to by in answering that by biting the bullet. Yes, this is a very, very demanding notion of what the
Mhm.
good life is. But in saying that, it's not a binary, or at least, and so what I defend from here on in as comprehensive liberalism is Toby's comprehensive liberalism, which draws on the historical tradition of Mill, but
Mhm.
reasons we've spent a bit of time outlining, I'm not defending everything the historical Mill said. This is my
Sure.
read of it. My read of it would be, and I think actually this is fairly contiguous with the historical Mill, is that choice is good, having options is good, and that thinking for yourself is good, and that this is good for people. Now, this does lead to a view of like, are we really going to be thinking through in detail what would further my character the most and lead to the most self-development? And, honestly, I say to my wife, "Could you don't just want to choose what we're having, where we're going for dinner tonight? I don't need
Yeah.
to think about this,
Mhm.
right?" But that I think there's a quote I really like of his where he says the human beings who inhabit even the more civilized part of the world are but starved specimens of what nature can and will produce. He has a
Mhm.
very aggressive view of what he thinks
Yes.
people can and should be. But I think that's right. I think people can be a lot more than they are. And I think the ability to do so, certainly within existent society, is heavily unequally distributed, both within countries and between countries. But at its best, a comprehensive liberalism doesn't look at that unequal distribution of opportunities to grow and develop and say, oh, well, therefore, this is only a doctrine for the comparatively privileged. It
Mhm.
says, well, this is a doctrine that looks at the fact that many do not have these opportunities and says, well, that's a huge problem. And
Mhm.
to remedy it, be it via more economic equality or more universal access to
Mhm.
education, so on and so forth. It says, yeah, we are a long way from it. This is, I think, and one of my points in its favor, much more than rules. This is a futurist creed. This is a futurist
Yes.
creed, much more than socialism is. This is a creed that is looking to the very, very long term. The difference, perhaps, with socialism is instead of having a specific plan or blueprint for that long term, we have a North Star. We have a set of values which we want that futurist society to achieve, but we
Mhm.
don't necessarily know all the details. We have something that is guiding us forward rather than a specific plan. Now, to the next point, I think there's something I would call autonomous non-autonomy. So you gave the example of Fleabag, just tell me what to do.
Yeah.
I would say there's so many moments in our lives where we choose to delegate authority. And I don't think that's a problem for a Millite approach. I think it becomes a problem if we say we want to do it for our lives entirely. But to use my example, I think very often both me and my wife would actively prefer it if the other one planned the day trip on the weekend.
Yes.
It's just work. And like I don't want to
Mhm.
be doing that mental labor. I'm sure we'll have a lovely time wherever. Can you just take care of it? But I want to unpick a number of assumptions in that. I am freely choosing to delegate that autonomy. I'm doing
Mhm.
so to someone I have a very high degree of confidence has my best interests at heart. And I'm doing it to someone I have a high degree of confidence knows enough about me to make decisions with me in mind. So there's a cheaper version of this, which is to go, look, if people choose to sort of outsource autonomy in a sense, that is their choice. That's still autonomy. I think I want to say something a bit thicker than that,
Mhm.
which is that no, it's not just, oh, you can choose to trust someone else. I think there's actually something that says even in yes, you can, and you have to. No one can make all their decisions all the time in a Millite way. You have to choose to trust other people. The world is just too big and too complex, right? But I think there's still a responsibility there in it. There's both a responsibility in how we do it, and also a sort of guidance that this way of thinking would offer us. The responsibility is, I think a lot of times people outsource autonomy to people they shouldn't do. And that in some sense, we might hold them accountable for that. So, to give a very obvious example, I think a lot of people outsource where they get their sort of political information from to people they obviously shouldn't be trusting because it makes them feel good and validates certain prejudicial instincts that they have.
Yes.
And I think there is a sense in which people can be held accountable for that and judged for that in the same way as if I take my car to the mechanics and he says, you need to get your brakes fixed, this is going to crash. And I say, well, I don't
Mhm.
trust this guy. Some guy on the internet told me it's fine and it crashes and kills my family. There isn't a sense that like I am blameworthy for having delegated my not exactly for having delegated my autonomy, but for having trusted the wrong person. I should
Yes.
have known better. Not that I should have known everything about my car, but I should,
Mhm.
given the moral stakes, have made a more reasonable decision
Yeah.
about who to trust. And I also think for our own goods, like the case of trusting my wife to plan a day trip is one thing. I think you might also ask, if you're trusting a particular, I don't know, to take an extreme case, cult leader, was that a good or just to take an extreme case the other way, was that a good or a sensible use of trust?
Yeah.
So I think there's a whole broad range. It's not, of course, it's not that you have to engage in this Millite reasoning for every decision you ever make.
No,
It's
of course not.
it's more that for some you are going to delegate that, but even in the delegated ones, I think we still want people in the driver's seat, ultimately, as it were, in some sense. There's then a broader question of the sort of does this lead to telling people what to do type questions, but I'll let you get
Yeah.
back in on what I just said.
And yeah, because that question right there brings that problem you bring up at the end raises for me the concern that does come up again, not just to quote Professor Levy's book, though he is the one that got me here to talk. When you do that, okay, how do we know that someone's in the driver's seat? Well, we know that someone's in the driver's seat practically. Now, you lauded taking things realistically and not looking at how things might work in some broad theoretical context, but how these ideas are actually mobilized
Hmm.
in actual politics. And the way that we tend to know, the way that people who make comprehensive liberal claims tend to say that we know whether or not someone's in the driver's seat, is whether or not their treatment by whatever person they've delegated their autonomy to matches up with the most recent trends in social science. Pragmatically, that's how it most often plays out. This is, you saw a lot of this happen during COVID, where people would hold up, and I'm a big believer, and I'm enraged. I'm enraged that I can't get my vaccine. I'm so upset that I have to go talk to a doctor now. RFK just put this through, RFK Jr., where I can't go down to the pharmacy. I have to get the shot through a doctor. I am not a fan of that kind of politics at all. I do think it was a massive epistemic problem at the start of the pandemic when the experts told us, listen, masks don't actually prevent the spread of disease that much. In that moment, they were drawing on a particular set of social science claims that wound up not ultimately panning out. Similarly, the one that's most common in this is you look at, okay, you talk in your article about um forming your gender identity. very important aspect.
Yeah.
You mentioned that what it is to be man. And I want to talk about that too in a second. But we had for a long time the early research on trans healthcare, particularly for underage people, showed that it produced positive psychological outcomes,
Mm.
that it really helped. It helped lower suicidality, it helped decrease these elements. And so comprehensive liberals would look at that and go, okay, if you have an environment, a social group that does not validate transness, that does not validate the view that one can change one's gender identity, a view that I happen to hold, or a view that one can validate one's own internal gender identity if it's at odds with one's birth identity, a view that I happen to hold, then that group is being oppressive, and we will try to save people from that group. I discussed this in the article when it gets to the teacher trainings that I
I
look
don't
into.
think that is what the core belief is for comprehensive liberals when it comes to trans rights. I
But
think
careful, hold on,
it's a
because we're
second
talking about
paper
core
that you.
beliefs versus political consequences here. I understand, and at least I would say if the story I'm mangling to a certain extent, the story is better told in Professor Levy's book. But what happens is what people wind up having, comprehensive liberals do tend to wind up having a pretty narrow conception of what a good life looks like for somebody. It looks like being roughly an educated urbanite. It looks like being the kind of person who votes for Kamala Harris and went to college and has those kind of backgrounds. And if a group is encouraging people to live in a different way other than that, then that group is oppressive. But it's a self fulfilling prophecy. It's a recursive kind of logic. We know, as comprehensive liberals, what it means to live a full life. So if you delegate your autonomy to a group, say the Roman Catholic Church, that tells you not to live like that, that tells you to abandon core aspects of that, that tells you that homosexuality is a disordered form of life,
Then yeah, the
then
Catholics are just wrong on that.
yeah, they are. But we can then say, like comprehensive liberal Susan Muller-Oken said, that Catholicism ought not gain. We ought to be able to force the Catholic Church to accept, say, female priests through state power, because to not do so is to put women in a subsidiary position.
But I
We
don't
know
think
that putting
most
women
comprehensive liberals think that second point.
I think if you look at the history that particularly a lot of the right non-liberals that I have looked into draw upon, the concerns of the like the Little Sisters of the Poor case in the United States, where
Yeah,
they applied for an exemption.
the sort of integralists are convinced that liberalism will become an oppressor of Catholicism in the same way Protestantism was, and I just don't think it's a serious concern. I don't. I think, look, so to maybe work.
I think there are real religious liberty concerns, and these religious liberty concerns draw from a core aspect of comprehensive liberalism that I believe traces back to Mill and that I believe you see in Mill's inheritors, which is that if you have a narrow, particularly an education based,
Hmm.
notion of what it takes to be a full flourishing individual, then that point that you raise, that autonomy point, it's autonomous to delegate your autonomy to somebody to something else or somebody else. That winds up not really carrying much cachet among rank and file comprehensive liberals. And at least in my experience, maybe you've had a different one, but if I talk to my comprehensive liberal friends, my progressive friends, and I get 2, 3 drinks into them, I can get them to throw out quite a bit of the free society and quite a bit of religious liberty under the guise of it is being oppressive to individuals within those structures because we already know, capital KNOW, know what it is to live a good life and to be a full flourishing individual. I don't
You
think
don't
that is
think,
going to be a successful base for a mass
but
politics in an era of skepticism of liberalism.
all of this is putting a bar to comprehensive liberalism that you'd never put to any ideology, and the
How
comprehensive.
so?
Let me work back through the examples. Firstly, with respect to sort of the trans case, I think that may be comprehensive liberals, or just liberals perhaps, being a little evasive about what their true commitments are.
Okay.
Liberals do not support LGBT rights because we have statistics to prove it. They support them because we believe in individual autonomy. Right? This is just, it's pure liberty principle.
But
Now,
you say it's good for people to have autonomy. You say that it is
yeah,
a
which is
necessary aid to human flourishing.
ultimately, I guess, an empirical claim.
Which
But
leaves you weak to this is another point I really wanted to raise. And sorry to interrupt, but I think this is going to help us get to the nub of our disagreement here. And one of the things that pluralist liberalism really has going for it to defend pluralist liberalism, which was kind of what I was called in here to do to some extent, if you make claims about what's actually good for people, if you make claims that what we do is what's good for people, we do this because it's good for people, you give people autonomy because it's good for them. And then I think at least we could accept philosophically in principle, even if there isn't a hard example we could agree on, that there might be elements of autonomy that are not ultimately aids to human flourishing. There might be moments in which we are best left, most people, most of the time, are best left committed to something whether they might like it in the moment or not. And that might aid human flourishing. At least that case of categories, that category of cases can exist, right? In that case, if it turns out that something is like that, if it turns out that something that flows from autonomy does not lead to human flourishing, does not actually make people happier, maybe it increases suicidality, like some of the later meta-analyses have been saying. I'm not taking a side in the empirical debate because I'm a neutralist liberal. I don't have to. I go, listen, some people want to do bad things for themselves. Being being trans and having trans medication doesn't seem to be any more harmful than drinking alcohol. We let people make bad decisions for themselves all the time, neither breaks your leg nor picks your pocket. Leave them alone. I do think it matters a lot when you say autonomy.
but
Autonomy is a
a
value. The question
comprehensive
is
liberal,
autonomy to
a
what?
comprehensive liberal can make the exact same argument.
In what sense?
In terms of, yeah, not everything that proceeds from autonomy is always good. People make bad decisions all the time. People become alcoholics all the time. One of the central cases in Mills on Liberty is that we shouldn't criminalize alcohol, which was a sort of movement
Mm,
was kicking off on his day. This is so the liberty principle is a rule designed to maximize the human good and human flourishing in the aggregate. It does not say that all people will make good use of that and that in every case it will lead to good outcomes. In many cases,
no.
it will lead to very bad outcomes. The claim is that as a first approximation, a society that lives by this rule will overall be happier and more flourishing than one that lives by any of the rules which are a realistic alternative to the
Yeah.
liberty principle. That's the claim. And that's what I mean. I mean, Mill's a utilitarian. This is just this is a second order consequentialist claim that overall, it's a bit like, you know, overall, we might think a society that has rules against perjury and theft will be more functional and have a higher
Mm,
standard of whatever goods we might care about than a society without those rules. Does that never mean that there might be an instance where enforcing those rules might be utility lowering? You know, to take a
mm,
classic case, does the judge hang an innocent man to prevent a riot that will kill 10 people? Well, that's a utility minimizing instance of a rule that we might think overall is utility
mm.
maximizing, right? Now, so yeah, I think with respect to the sort of telling people, so there's two concerns. There's the telling people how to live, and are we just reasoning based on what's good for people, based on our own self-conception, right? So like is this just sort of educated Kamala Harris voters who live in big cities thinking everyone should be like that?
Mm.
Um, so, two bullet biting things. All political doctrines involve coercing people. And that is a bullet
Yes.
you just have to bite. And there is a reluctance to bite that bullet on the part of neutralist liberalism. I think you will get it among the more sophisticated neutralist liberals.
Mm,
But as this idea exists popularly, there really does seem to be the delusion, and I say delusion as an intentionally hard word, that we
mm.
can create a society that is purely founded on rational informed consent. And of course we fucking can't.
Yeah.
Every
Right.
society will involve enforcing itself on people who it cannot justify itself to. It's one of the reasons I like of modern Rawlsian treatments. Nuti and Badano's book, Politicizing Political Liberalism, is they just bite this,
Mhm.
Rawlsianism will involve people who cannot be made to see the good of this having to accept it. And that
Mhm.
is true for everything. It's true of political liberalism, it's true of comprehensive. Now, that this second point of do we reason too much from our own experience is also true of both political liberalism and comprehensive liberalism. That
Yes.
we even think neutrality is a good thing in the first place is grounded in a particular society and particular politics. And I've also called attention to, in other words, it's quite a recent idea. This is not something that
Mhm.
has long antecedents, nor I haven't done the comparative work here, but I strongly suspect is not something that's particularly shared globally. And even
Mhm.
within our own societies, it's much more of an elite thing. We're talking a very minority view. And yet, this is the view apparently everyone has to live by. Is that true of comprehensive liberalism? Yeah, to a degree. I think
Mhm.
that comprehensive liberalism does yeah, like, it's obviously the people who hold that view are not demographically representative, even within their own
Mhm.
societies, much less history in the world,
Mhm.
is going to lead to certain biases. So, where am I going with all of that? All political doctrines, by necessity, their application will involve inflicting themselves on people who they cannot justify themselves to. And
Mhm.
I think all political doctrines will be biased and particular in some ways. That's just how human beings think. We're anecdotal thinkers. We reason from our
Yep.
experience. Here's my claim. Comprehensive liberalism does those things far, far, far less than any other doctrine that has ever ruled or has ever tried to.
Okay.
Yeah, comprehensive liberals will involve telling people what to do, but most of the time that liberalism has been in actual power, it's comprehensive liberalism. Liberalism has carved out, for reasons relating to people's own good, essentially, far more spheres of pluralism, and it has tolerated far more dissent than any other regime that's ever existed. It's not to say it's tolerated all dissent,
Yep.
and it's not to say it's never violated its own rules to crush dissent. Of course it has. To a degree, liberalism is open there to a charge of hypocrisy in a way that, say, integralism isn't,
Yeah.
because integralism doesn't
Yeah.
claim to care about free speech and pluralism.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I will take much more openness with perhaps a degree of hypocrisy where it isn't open than no openness at all. Now, likewise to the particularist view, yeah, you can run this line that, that maybe like some comprehensive liberals are, a bit dismissive of people who want to question the official line on vaccines or something. Sure. I guess I just ask compared to what, you know?
And so let's talk about compared to what. Let's look at that because I would say the question isn't whether or not comprehensive liberals do coercion at all. You are
Because, sorry,
completely
final
right.
point, to just compare,
Yes.
my final point, because you can say compared to, oh, but my claim is neutral liberalism has never really existed and cannot really
Yeah.
exist. Like, it's
Yeah.
not a realizable ideal, even in a
Hmm.
flawed sense. And so I think what can sometimes happen is the actual practice of comprehensive liberalism. And of course, if you get a particular comprehensive liberal five drinks in, you can get them to say some mean things about conservatives. But the actual practice of
I'd say authoritarian things about conservatives and religious groups. Like I think you can get them to say, we need to force priests to violate the
yeah,
seal of the
sure.
confessional.
Sure. So,
Like
but are
that's
we
bad
comparing?
stuff.
Okay, and compare that to what you can get a Trump voter to say five drinks.
Uh-huh. So yes, and so but
Right.
and so
But
I want to
so
bite this
we
point.
compare that to a fantasy of political liberalism that
Mhm.
does not exist and cannot exist. And so I would say, look, if we're comparing real world stuff, let's compare real world comprehensive liberalism to anything else which might conceivably rule, of which
Mhm.
political liberalism is not one, right? It's the
Mhm.
best of the options that we have.
So that's a great way to go because I think I'm going to kind of put this bluntly, and maybe we can smarten it up after that. I think you're really comfortable going after political liberals from a side of realism. You're really comfortable to go, they've got this, airy political doctrine with no kind of grounding in the real world. But my ideology, and it's true, your ideology actually does have adherents. You can find comprehensive liberals walking around. I live in Portland, Oregon. I find comprehensive liberals walking around. You know what I mean? Which is why my ultimate problem, I've got things I like about neutralist liberalism, but the ultimate problem that I have is it kind of looks like you're going, this ideology, political liberalism, has two people who believe in it. My ideology has like 10% of the population that believes in it. That's why we should use it as the ground for a mass politics against what looks to me and what it sounds like looks to you like an increasingly illiberal public, a public that is increasingly exhausted with liberalism, exhausted with choice, happier to share their bigotries, happier to make their desire for other people's humiliation the core of their politics. These
I'd be
you're
careful about ascribing
you
those
are
to the public writ large. We're in a 50-50 country at the moment, as is a lot of the world.
but I would say political liberals are a tiny part of the liberal coalition. Comprehensive liberals are a larger but still small part of the liberal coalition. Most people part of the liberal coalition have kind of dinner table issues. That's these real kind of low bandwidth stuff we talked about with
No, I'm not.
your
I'm not.
published
I'm
article.
not sure that's right. I think, people who would self-consciously cite either Mill or Rawls are presumably a vanishingly small percentage of the population. But people,
But you really don't think, hold on.
most people would have an opinion on gay marriage if you asked them, and if you asked most people who are for it, you'd probably get a comprehensive liberal reason out of them.
I'm not confident on that. I was actually reading the article with my fiance and she pointed this out. Like, at least in my experience, I come from a pretty sort of redneck town in Oregon that was kind of right on the knife's edge of a lot of these questions in the mid 2000s. And the argument that I saw having the most success at that particular time, at that particular location, with the persuadable, with the people who should be your first target, building a comprehensive liberal political movement, peeling people away from fascism. What worked on them wasn't I met a gay person or my son wound up being gay and I wanted him to be happy. What worked more was I don't care what people do. It's not my business. I want to leave it alone. I heard a lot more neutralist logic out of people at that particular historical juncture at that particular issue than I heard comprehensive liberal logic. Now, I think comprehensive liberalism has a better philosophical explanation. And so I think in conversations like these, and since that position solidified, it's taken outsized importance. But I would say, kind of just on a gut level, and maybe if I can't persuade you of this, I'll appeal to the listeners to a certain extent, but like, don't you feel and see among other people a kind of exhaustion with choice, with self creation, with needing an endless optionality and these kinds of things, the rejection of which are pulling a lot of people over to the more radical left right now? Don't you? It seems to me ultimately, like I said at the start, when I pushed you on this, you said, but Mill's just right. And he might be. But if things are swinging as badly as they are, if things are as bad as you say they are, when you're in your mode where you talk about how fascism is upon us, I loved your article on the Trump alarmists were right because you were. I was one of them. I went to his rally in 2016 and I looked him in the eye and I said, this man likes hurting people.
Hmm.
This man enjoys using power to hurt people. And I saw my friends flocking to him, people who I respected, people who I thought had a stronger moral core than that. There are some times in my theorization, sometimes during my time in grad school, where I sort of got frustrated. I would be like, I sometimes feel like I'm the only person who's still theorizing like we're in a fascist takeover and I'm still scared of Trump. You have to sit in this kind of awkward place between a real idealist, like the political liberals, like the neutralist liberals, and a real pessimist, like me, and go, listen, things are bad enough to where political liberalism and neutralist liberalism is obviously ridiculous. That's never going to get a grip on the population. People just don't find that morally appealing. But things aren't so bad. We're not so far down the path of illiberalism, growing, swallowing,
Hmm.
crushing illiberalism, that my particular brand of liberalism, which is mannered, which is elite, which does come from that background at a start, and does express itself among those people as a matter of political fact, my thing still has a chance to gain a foothold in that
See,
world. And I think we're too
I
far
disagree with
past that.
I disagree with the characterization, two characterizations. One, that it's my brand of liberalism that people are reacting against. Firstly, I don't see
Yes.
fascism as reacting against liberalism, either political or neutral. Fascism is an gentle ideology with ideas, plans, and goals. It has a vision for what it wants us to live like that is not ultimately because liberals pissed them off, it's because that's what they believe in the world. I
But
don't,
I'm not talking about those
I
people. I'm talking about the people who are
well,
on
hang on,
that
you
margin
put a lot of
who go
points on the
there.
table. Let me try and get through some of them.
Yeah, okay.
So I don't buy that in general. I also don't buy the view that comprehensive liberalism is necessarily an elite doctrine. Yes, you can probably find a reasonable preponderance among it, among people with a college degree and so on, but people with a college degree are part of America and are part of the country. I also think it's just how most people reason morally most of the time. And it hasn't been the elite representation of liberalism. The elite representation of liberalism for the last generation or so has been neutral liberalism. It's been political liberalism. That's the one that's been in the driver's seat. So if people are reacting to anything, they're reacting to that. Now, are people just getting tired of choice and being told what to do? It's an attractive narrative that I really just don't buy. I think it's an easy one to retrofit. I think people are angsty. People are angsty in every society. And people feel like they don't fit in and they don't know what their life path is. And I think this has always been true. You know, I doubt the medieval peasants living under divine right were really filled with a sense of meaning and belonging so doing, right? And so I think, you know, if you're feeling angsty, it can be easy to go, well, I'm angsty because of choice and because I have too much of it. I think overall, it has been a net good that people have had more choice relative to earlier non-liberal societies, but people are still unhappy and angsty, and you can sometimes just displace that reason onto it. No, I don't think that is what's driving people towards Trump, nor do I think that is necessarily a common feeling. I think when you look at what's putting people on the sort of left, it's that people feel incredibly constrained. And for a variety of legitimate reasons. I think if you look at the socialist left, their concerns are ultimately about freedom. A lot of the time, they wouldn't always put it that way, but the concern is that I have to get a job, I have to have a car, I have to live under a certain capitalist structure, I have to kiss my boss's ass, even though I think he's an
Hmm.
asshole. I don't feel in control of my own life,
Hmm.
is the concern a lot of the time. It's in many ways what drives people to socialism is in a lot of ways a classically liberal concern that liberalism has not fully addressed.
And all that might be the case, but it does start to sound suspiciously to me like real comprehensive liberalism has never been tried.
But that's
And I,
it's been partially tried. It's never had hegemony, to use an overused phrase. Liberalism is not hegemonic either in terms of its control of state structures or its control of society and culture. And both critics of liberalism and weirdly some liberals have sort of approached this question as if liberalism was hegemonic. But look, the constitutional design of the United States is a mixture of several different ideological currents, some liberal, some sort of proto-liberal, some conservative, some traditional, some fucking early modern weird monarchical shit, went
Hmm.
into there. Likewise, our culture certainly has a liberal influence in it. And certainly, if you look at the people who say make popular music or make movies, I'm sure they skew democratic voting. But at the same time, the cultural norms about what we think marriage is and what that does, the social taboos that would govern a business meeting, these things are all implicitly conservative. So, no, we live under a mixed regime. And certainly, if you look internationally, we talk about the liberal world order. What liberal world order? There's only a handful of liberal governments in there. We're talking mostly conservative, if not overtly authoritarian states making decisions for overtly illiberal reasons. We do not live in anything like a hegemonically liberal world. We live in a world in which liberalism is one power amongst many and
Hmm.
not necessarily the dominant power, and increasingly not the dominant power. That's the reality. And so if you have this delusion of liberal hegemony, then it becomes very easy to say whatever's happening with Trump or Orban or whatever, that's a reaction against liberalism. That must mean that liberalism gave us too much choice. Whereas in fact, it's just an element of politics and ideas that has always been there and has found new expression and is increasingly on the upswing.
So if, you know, the point about fascism being an agential ideology is well taken. I want to acknowledge that. Certainly at the hard core of it, the movers and the shakers, the Stephen Millers of this world, who wanted to do this from day one, right? The bigger concern and what I sort of feel you're talking around would be uncharitable, but what I don't hear you addressing fully is why do those ideas have such purchase now? And even leave alone the why. If we are past a threshold such that those ideas have so much purchase,
Hmm.
such that we didn't just elect a bigoted reality TV show star, we Grover Clevelanded him. First one since we brought him back for a non-consecutive term.
Yeah.
And there are lots of contingent reasons for that, but I do not like what that says about the things that otherwise morally normal people now find acceptable or even worse, kind of banal,
Yeah.
kind of not worth comment. The worsening that has spread out from
But the
Trump. We can talk
phrase
about
morally normal people is carrying quite a lot of weight in that sentence. So yeah, okay, yeah. So why are people going towards Trump? I will merely
and maybe
I will I
is it
will
so
merely
is it too bad? Is it too
yeah,
bad now?
yeah, I will merely note, first of all, that that is a question that gets put to people who argue not just in the comprehensive versus political, but the general sort of vibe and tone and tenor of my politics, right?
Mhm.
The sort of delicate balancing act you described of this is really fucking bad and really dangerous, and it is still a fight worth fighting and that we can win, right?
Mhm.
That the question of, okay, but why are people going to Trump is a question that gets really pushed on us as a kind of defeating argument that they themselves are equally unable to provide a compelling answer to, right? However, nonetheless, like I don't think political liberalism has any good answer to that question.
I agree.
Like any, like however flawed the again, let's compare comprehensive liberalism to the
Yeah.
alternatives. Political liberalism doesn't have any answer at all. Let me make one point to just start, because it's a big question. And look,
Yeah.
in a nation of 300 million souls, why one? It's always going to be multi-causal, right? There's always going to be lots of
Sure.
different things that went into it. But perhaps one thing as a framing device that we might note is that in the three elections he's run, Donald Trump has got mid to high 40% of the vote, right?
Yeah.
Um, I forget the exact figures, but it's like 46, 47, 49, something like that,
Mhm.
right? If I showed you in 2008, 2012, what the results of the 2016 election were, but I didn't tell you what who the candidates were, it
Hmm.
wouldn't strike you as particularly unusual. Yeah, another 50-50 election. Okay, we had a popular vote electoral college split, but we kind of knew that was coming for some time anyway. But the fact that a Republican won after 2 terms of Democratic governance by a narrow margin when the economy was middling, this is all very, very much par for the course. Now, I say all that not to say that something didn't change. Clearly it did.
Hmm.
Rather, what changed was something within the Conservative coalition, right? That there's, and we see this the world over, the sort of collapse of the centre right. What's happened isn't that there are people who were at one point convinced by liberalism, be it political or comprehensive or anything else, and then suddenly went, I like what this guy Trump is selling. No, what's happened is that there's people who've always voted conservative, or at least always been open to voting conservative, or maybe didn't, people somewhere on that side of the aisle for whom Trump might have been a deal breaker before, but now no longer was. And in fact,
Hmm.
might is now someone who's energizing. So, in many ways, I think the story. Now, there are swing voters and there are crossover voters, and we can talk about them, but
Hmm.
statistically, they're smaller. I'd say the first big thing to talk about is what has happened to conservatism over the last 10
Yeah,
to
I mean, we could do
20
that.
years. You know, and I think that's actually the first question. Before we even get onto where liberalism went wrong, and I have my opinions there, right? But
Mm.
before we even get onto that, what's happened to conservatism? And like before we even get into where has, say, centre-left liberalism fallen down, what the fuck has happened to the centre-right?
Yeah.
I think it's a first framing question before we even get into that. This is a story as much as anything about really the collapse of institutional conservatism in many senses. And it's not just America, this is global. You can certainly look at the UK in this respect as well.
Yeah.
So when answering this question of like, okay, but why now? There are historical stories I can tell of the lead in, and we want if we want to talk about why particular demographics experienced swing, we can talk about that. But I almost feel
Mhm.
like maybe we want to start there as a way of getting our framing right.
And I'll start there. And I think that whether or not we can call this a diagnosis or a prediction depends on your story of the last 10 years, to what extent you believe the Great Awakening happened, to what extent you think the content of it was. I imagine we're going to disagree on that.
Yeah.
So you can take it either as a prediction or as a description of our current moment. But I see a hollowing out of the center. I see a collapse of the liberal elements that bonded the center right and the center left. I see a degradation of that liberal core. The kinds of people who could, I'm a disaffected Ron Paulite from way back in the day.
Oh
And
wow.
then I looked around and I went, wow, I actually believed in all this anti-government stuff. And all of a sudden everybody's with Trump saying they want to ban flag burning. And I thought we all knew that this wasn't what we were doing. We didn't all know that that's what we were like. You don't got to tell me I was there, right? Turns out, what is it? Thomas Massey had a good quote on this where he was like, we use spicy language already. He's like, we thought people were down for libertarianism, but it turns out people just wanted the craziest motherfucker in the room. And Donald Trump was the craziest motherfucker in the room. They just went to him. My story, whether or not you believe it's already happened or is going to happen, is that there is a hollowing out of that liberal center. There's a weakening of the general appeal across societies. You're right, it is a global phenomenon, which I think limits explanations that rely too much on the Southern strategy here or Margaret Thatcher there. There has been a collapse in the broad appeal of liberal principles, qua liberal principles, whether they be neutralism or whether they be appeals to autonomy. Against that backdrop, this is where I want to give the neutralist liberal some love. Because you don't got to believe. There's a reading of the existence of reasonable comprehensive doctrines, taking the existence of reasonable comprehensive doctrines as a premise in your theorizing. There's a read of that that's kind of kumbaya. We're all going to be friends with each other. Everybody's got some good ideas. Let's come together and make an overlapping consensus out of them. But there's a harsher version of it, which is closer to what Kevin Valier talks about, which is you take these core deep disagreements as a ground of politics, as a way of saying these things aren't going to go away, as a way of saying the kind of victory that you seem to want to shoot for. And I'm unclear about the structure of this, so I might want to hear what you think about this. But when you talk, for instance, in your article about these people, these fascists, these bigots, they can't be argued out of this. They can only be defeated or deprogrammed.
Mhm.
That presumes there is a successful method of deprogramming, or we better hope there is one. That
But I
presumes,
mean, you see that people do stop being bigots.
but not at anything like the rate that we've been wanting, at least not for the last 10
I agree.
years.
I agree. And again,
So,
I just go back to compared to what?
so what I look at is, and what I wind up advocating more thickly in my dissertation is these kinds of non-liberal demands, they're not going to go away. You're not going to ever, if you ever had, it's interesting you say liberalism was never hegemonic, because it seems like you would need some kind of liberal hegemony to be able to deprogram people at the rates that you would need and with the institutions that you would need in order to make a meaningful dent in this crisis of illiberalism and non-liberalism that we're seeing. I go, that's not going to happen. Or at the very least, I go, we should at least have a backup plan, assuming that it's not going to happen. And given that these non-liberal views are gaining currency, given that, you talk about the long 90s as a kind of exception period.
Yes.
And there's a part of me in my gut that I go out, and I agree, but I kind of go out broader. I'm like, if you look historically, maybe liberalism is the exception period.
Maybe.
Maybe this
Well,
period
if you
where
go
we
out,
started thinking about, maybe we don't force people to live the way that we want to live. Maybe we want to give people some capacity to self-define. Boy, is that not the historical norm. Boy, is that not how the vast majority of humans who have ever lived had looked at the topic. And so I draw upon, you know, research about subsidiarity, research about devolution of power to subnational units, research about intensive uses of federalism to handle originally. It's a great article on this called "The Many Uses of Federalism" by Donald Horowitz, and he goes into the way federalism has been used to break up some really tough racial disputes in various countries, especially like the kind of third world countries, quote unquote. And I argue if it's worked for them with things as deep and as damaging and as hardwired in some ways as ethnic conflict and ethnic issues, it should work for more developed, quote unquote, polities on ideological issues, ideological tensions in general having been lower stakes than ethnic tensions, at least during the 20th century. So compared to this kind of modus vivendi devolved. If you ever had Chandran Kukathis on your program, I don't go as far as him. Very few people go as far as him, but I do advocate for a similar kind of retreat and retrenchment if things are as bad as many comprehensive liberals keep telling me that they are. I'm not sure what kind of victory you want, what kind of victory you need, what kind of victory you envision, and whether any of those victories are possible starting from where we are right now, realistically today. And that is an empirical claim, not a theoretical claim about whether or not Mill was correct. You see what I mean?
okay, so firstly, there is no such thing as a final victory in politics. There will always be disagreement, there will always be contestation, and it simply goes on. Indeed, one of my critiques of political liberalism is that it, in its perhaps let us say popular vulgar form, imagines a sort of stasis to which we will enter. Now, whatever the fuck Francis Fukuyama actually meant by the phrase the end of history, it
You know
is
what it means now.
nonetheless typifies a certain sort of thinking that had become prevalent among political elites during the 90s. My view is that there are periods of consensus and overlap and periods of divergence in politics. There are goods that can be found in those periods of consensus, but they're never ultimately stable or permanent for reasons that I could explicate. So to go backwards through a few of some of the points, I think though that there is this sort of bait and switch of it said, oh, well, your approach hasn't worked, so we need to go back to this sort of politically neutral approach. The politically neutral approach is the one that has been leading the team. It is the one that has been in power through this period. So if there's a case to be made that someone needs to take a look in the mirror and think, have we fought against the rising tide of fascism in the most efficacious way? I would say it would be the quarterback, not some guy in the stands, right? That's
Hmm.
that's that's the first point. And that is, this is my article on rules, in that there's been a timidity about elite liberalism in opposing fascism that I think many people are beyond frustrated with, that I don't think is incidental to its pretensions of neutrality. I think what exactly John Rawls himself might have thought, and there are different ways you can take the Rawlsian tradition. I mentioned Nuti and Badano, who have a very sort of aggressive anti-MAGA interpretation of it. But nonetheless, for most powerful people, most of the time, I think there's been a sort of let's treat them fairly, let's hear both sides,
Hmm.
let's not be dismissive or arrogant or elitist. There's been a fear of that, whereas actually,
Yeah.
what you need to do is very just clearly explain why the other side is wrong. And I think one of the things we've seen in practice, even if in theory you could take it in different directions, is that a neutral political liberalism has just not proved itself capable of going on a war footing. And I think the feeling amongst most liberals, and I'm not just talking about a few snooty college professors, I'm talking the
Hmm.
Democratic primary electorate writ large.
Yes.
I think the overwhelming feeling you see in Democratic primary election after Democratic primary election is we want to fight. We don't know if we'll win, but we want to fight, is I think the
Hmm.
overwhelming vibe, regardless of like if they have a self-conscious philosophy about it or not, where most liberals are at most of the time, and they feel their leadership has not fought and they want them to fight. And that's basically where I'm at. I think liberals are
Yeah.
apt to feel this way. Now, to your point about, okay, but like is it possible to win right now? I don't know. I'm not giving up. I think societies are so big and so complex that I think any overly determined view where you just start saying, well, okay, this path is inevitable, is always just analytically wrong. Like weird stuff happens all the time. To maybe explicate that a bit, imagine if what people thought was going to happen in 2016 actually happened, i.e., a comfortable Hillary. She carries it by 6 points or something, right?
Hmm.
Comfortable Hillary win. Say even retakes Congress because Donald Trump was so
Hmm.
unpopular, right? Well, then I think we actually like sidestep a lot of this. Now, we'll still be in a case where there will be a radicalized opposition against her. But I think a lot of the leadership of the Republican Party, both within formal political structures, but also like executives on Fox News and so on,
Hmm.
would take a deep breath and go, well, that didn't work. Let's maybe get a bit more of a handle on our activist base and present someone a bit saner. And let's just say, for sake of argument, it was a landslide. Let's just say she crushed him by 15 points, right?
Hmm.
Well, then if that happens, and then let's say conservatism stays radical, but again, we get another Democratic victory in what would it be, the 2018 midterms, right?
Hmm.
If just we get two decisive back-to-back results against this, then I think conservative elites begin to wrestle a bit of power back from their activists and say, to the conservative base, look, I understand you guys liked their sort of red meat approach, but this just isn't working and we need to do something else. And there's many instances of political parties on the left and the right having that renegotiation. Now, we'll still have problems. There'll still be fascists out there, and I don't think the danger will have fully passed, but I think that puts us on a radically different path. And I say that to illustrate how contingent a lot of this stuff
Yeah.
is. you know? And I don't know. I think obviously in retrospect, and even at the time, the 2016 election was a pretty big branching point, right, in terms of the
Hmm.
paths that we got on. But there will be other branching points coming up, right? Now, two big, overwhelming back-to-back landslide elections now wouldn't do the same thing. It wouldn't quite do the same thing as it would then. We're too far down this path, the rot is too deep, but it would still do a lot, you know? And I think there will be branching points that allow decisive victories on our side. By those victories, at the moment, I merely mean control of the state, right? Like that's what has to come back to us, right?
Hmm.
And I don't just mean control of the state in the narrow sense of the presidency. I think it also has to be institutions like the Supreme Court and the courts in general.
Yeah.
And all of this, if you ask me to put odds on it, do I think we'll achieve that? I probably wouldn't take an even money bet, but nor do I think it's a sort of 0.1% chance sort of thing, as I think some people have seemed to get in their heads. Societies are
Yeah.
bigger and more complex and more contingent than that.
I guess maybe again to go back to an earlier point, like the global nature of it seems to undercut the contingency point. Like you're right, maybe if Hillary had beaten Trump, but this isn't just Trump, it's Orban and it's Le Pen and it's the increasing things you see in the UK and I believe I believe that there is, and I take as a kind of a premise that there is a underlying shift that's happening here. There is a change in how people, especially people in the weird countries, Western educated, industrialized, rich democracies, view their politics and view what's acceptable in the realm of politics and view, that old political liberal consensus, which was never much of a consensus to begin with. We agree on that. Again, I often feel like all I'm doing is taking people who doomsay about this at their word and going, okay, if things are that bad, and if they're happening across all this area, I'm having a hard time pinning you down here because at times, in your writing especially, it sounds like we are at a particularly dire moment in history
Yes.
that's global and that is happening in a bunch of different places, which would speak to an underlying sort of dynamic. And then when I try to pin you down on it, you start telling me about the contingencies of 2016 and 2020. And I'm not sure that's consistent, and I'm not sure it's an accurate diagnosis of the depth of the problem. I believe, just to a certain extent, if I'm going to really get pointed, I believe you are doing a sliding scale of how fascist things are, such a way that is convenient for you to fill your core moral commitment,
Why,
your core
why, why is
political.
why is contingency not compatible with how fascist things are?
Because it would seem like if it were something as contingent as like whether or not Donald Trump won by a landslide or won by a squeaker or got swept by a landslide, then it wouldn't be. It's not impossible for that kind of dynamic to occur across all these different countries,
Oh, but
all around
I
the
don't see
same
that. So
15 to 20 year
I,
period.
I don't see that as like in any way opposed. I think the fact that you're seeing it, maybe not globally, but certainly, like you say, across weird countries, does not necessarily imply it's like some. And see, I think the other story's weirder, that there's like some deep malaise in the soul that liberalism has caused, and this is a symptom of it. That just seems like a bizarre story to me. No, I mean, what we're seeing is global convergence. The historical pathways in to Trump and Brexit, which are the two cases I know the best, are
Yeah.
very distinct, right? Those are both very particular to those countries. The historical pathways in to Trump are, like you say, things like the Southern strategy and that block of votes in
Mhm.
America, which are particular to America. There's nothing like that in the UK. But we also have our own long-running inter-coalitional political divides that led us to Brexit. The pathways in are different, but we live in an interconnected world. And what we've seen is that from that place of, you get Orban, you get Brexit, you get Trump. The people who have got themselves in those positions are looking around the world and they're taking influence from each other. Certainly, conservative activists all around the world hang out on the same forums online and are in the same
Mm.
social media bubbles and whatever. And they take notes from each other and they take influence from each other, sometimes overtly, sometimes subtly. And so you've seen these forces that had very different historical pathways in start to converge around a set of ideas, a set of grievances, a common rhetoric. So you see in the UK, for instance, our politicians are now starting to pick up American culture war vocabulary that has absolutely no antecedents in
Yep.
political life. They're
I've been
starting,
going to school in Canada, and the same thing's happening in
yeah,
Canada,
but,
100%.
but that's convergence. It's not some deep social rot across weird countries. It's the fact that the right in all those countries is looking at each other and taking influence from each other. And that's just a very common pattern historical. The mid 20th century fascists did the same. They had they didn't have the internet, but they had little conferences where they got together
Mhm.
and took ideas from each other. Socialism was self-consciously a global movement, right?
Mhm.
Um, Feminism, decolonialization. What
Mhm.
we make a lot about how Martin Luther King took influence from Gandhi, but that's just to say they were part of a sort of anti-apartheid global movement that were all looking at what everyone else was doing and what was working for them. Neo-fascism, if we can call it that, is no different.
Yeah.
It is the paths in, we are in, if Brexit and Trump both lose, we are in such a different world. But that's not contradicted by convergence. That just says, okay, once we got to that point where we had several countries had empowered a sort of radical right at the same time, albeit for quite different historical pathways, those
Mhm.
radical rights started looking at each other and taking notes. And because America is in many ways the cultural hegemon, America has led the world. It's not been an even sort of flow of cultural influence. I would say
Yeah.
places like the UK have followed the
Mhm.
US much more than the other way round. But nonetheless, across the board, you have a broad convergence. And people always throw the globalized point at me as if it's just a, so there's something to unpick here. People always throw the
I hope
global.
I'm presenting you with points rather than throwing them at you. I hope that I'm at least we're
Sure.
speaking them to you rather than
But I
chucking them.
was talking to some political theorists at the University of York. I did a talk there,
Mm.
and this was the sort of point they circled back to is, but it's globalized, and it's like, yes, it's globalized. I'm really like, I think if you're just aware that movements in different countries take notes from each other and they can converge, like I don't understand why the fact that it's globalized is seen as such a defeater for a combative liberalism that wants to fight.
Yeah. Let me steelman that point, then let me try to argue why I don't need it to make the point that I'm trying to make.
Okay.
So to steelman that point, I think it is, again, put dumbly, we can smarten it up. You've got, how are you going to explain this phenomenon?
Yeah.
You could have a bunch of different agential actors from a bunch of different sources appealing to a bunch of different underlying causes. That's a lot of variables. You could have the story that you just told, which I think has got a persuasive element to it, of one kind of set of agential actors sharing notes and comparing, selling to a bunch of different
It's at
contingent
least
historical
part of it,
factors.
right?
Yeah,
It's not the
yeah,
whole story. It's at least it's
yeah,
got to be at least part of it.
yeah. I think the logic that's maybe underlying the why this is such a defeater for people is what seems even simpler, what seems even to have fewer variables associated with it, even more theoretically parsimonious, is to assume that one group of people, activists of this, neo-right movements, are selling to an underlying thing that is shared between these cases. Like this is how you're taught to think about things in comparative politics in a lot of ways,
Hmm.
you know? So that intuition, I think, stands on its own. And I just want to say, I tried to not say, I implied it, but at least when I was backing off and trying to pare my argument down, I tried to not say there is this deep intrinsic malaise that liberalism has produced. I kind of feel it, when I walk around some days, I kind of feel a little bit of malaise.
Is that not just
But
human condition?
but boy, we better hope the human condition isn't causing people to be amenable to stuff that's not liberalism. We better hope the human
It is.
condition doesn't
It
bias
is.
people against liberalism. So if that's the case,
I think
why does just doing liberalism louder the solution to this problem?
not louder,
If
different.
Yeah, you said louder in one of your articles, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, liberalism needs, I think I used the word more aggressive. But yeah, part of being more, I think yeah, part of being more aggressive is putting your arguments differently, putting them more overtly. I think the challenge with the deep malaise is, yeah, people feel deep malaise, and there will always be people who come along and say, the fact that you're feeling deep malaise, that's because you need to join my cult, or that's because you
Mm,
need to accept a king, or that's because liberalism has spiritually failed you and you need to join our glorious neo-Reich. Yeah, you'll always have. I mean, this is just literally how cults work. Is they find people when they're not feeling comfortable in the world, which is a lot of people a lot of the time, maybe most people most of the time,
mm,
and say, you're broken, or maybe your
yeah,
society's broken, and I can fix you. That's the fascism, but there'll always be people who do that, right? Like I don't think we get to a point where people never feel a malaise that is exploitable. I think what we
yeah.
can do is clearly warn people against the people who might exploit it. I think
Mm,
that's all you can do. Now, maybe we'll be successful in making that case, and maybe we won't. But I think it's just more useful to just tell the truth. The truth is there are things wrong with our society, certainly. Certainly, people feel malaise. These people are lying to you. What they are selling you
yeah.
will not fix your malaise. It will not fix the things in society that might be fueling that malaise. And in fact, it will make both of those worse, right?
Mm,
I think that's all you can do. And maybe people will heed those warnings, maybe they won't. And to take the cult analogy, once people are actually in cults, it is very difficult to get them out.
mm,
It's not that you never do, but it is hard, right?
mm,
It's better to warn them in advance. And now we're in a harder place where we have to try and pull a lot of people out. We're like the family members who see, their brother or son or sister or whoever
mm.
has been sucked into this awful cult and has been warned not to listen to them and pulled away from them. And we have to find a way to pull them out again.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's a rough position to be in. But I don't think the answer there is to sort of start validating the cult's rhetoric and language and concerns and saying, yes, this cult leader is actually right, that there is something poisonous about all of society, and that our family before the cult came along was abusive and flawed in the way that this cult family member, in the way that this cult is
Yeah.
alleging that we are. No, no, the answer is this cult is lying to you. Will we ultimately be able to talk people into that? I don't know. I think
Mm.
I think we want to at least try. And as much as anything else, I feel better about myself for trying. I think, if where we all end up is,
Well, as long as you feel good about yourself.
well,
Like,
if where we all end up is a sort of literal fascism, right? Which I think is a reasonable option that's on the table.
mhm.
Yeah, I want to feel like I at least said my piece and did what I could against it.
Yeah. And I joke as someone who is coming at this from a much more pessimistic standpoint. Even than you, and you do not sound particularly optimistic in the thing that you just laid out. Um, let me then let me try to hit you with an argument that I came up with when I was reading your piece that might explain why there actually is a malaise associated with comprehensive liberalism, such that it will recurrently run into these kinds of complaints, these kinds of problems, even if from your perspective, they seem to lack a kind of grounding to them, or like compared to what? I was thinking about the example that you brought up where you were talking about, and you've talked about this in several areas, your exhaustion with the men are being left behind. Men need to be heroic. Men need roles to follow, things like this. And you talk about, you know, comprehensive liberalism, one of the benefits of it, vis-a-vis political liberalism, is that it can provide people with a story of the good life. It can provide people with, we can help you. There are these concrete things we can do to boost your autonomy, and this autonomy is good for you. That's great. And I imagine myself coming to you because this is something I think about a lot, both as a man and as someone who wants to raise kids someday. And I go, okay, comprehensive liberal, how do I be a good man? And in your own article, a couple paragraphs down, you go, well, you can be masculine or feminine or kind of both.
Mhm.
That's a little thinner than I think people are looking for. I'm not sure. I buy a lot of your arguments that like not every man needs to be a hero. I don't think it needs to be that high a standard. But telling
I think
somebody,
I am saying something a bit thicker in that article. I'm just not giving people a list of instructions, but do you not?
but I think a lot of people, at the very least, I would say I submit, if not to your approval, then to the approval of people who worry about this stuff, who feel this felt need to achieve masculinity in a way that you have admitted that you don't. Um, I think going, listen, you can go to the gym or you can wear a dress, all of that, or in between, speaks to a kind of hollowness at the core of comprehensive liberalism that puts it in a really nasty place to be the grounds for the kind of mass political movement that you want to make it. Because the question is, okay, we maximize people's autonomy, but autonomy to what? If comprehensive liberalism doesn't have an answer for that, if it can look at somebody and say, being a man is so devoid of content that I can't even tell you that it's not manly to be feminine. Which we can talk about the positive political valences of it. For a lot of people, that's a very confusing and very counterintuitive statement.
So I would just go back to like ultimate moral and philosophical truth
But
of
before we go
this
back to
point.
those, I want to drill in on this point to make it clear what's at stake. If you can't give people that story, if comprehensive liberalism, the autonomy to what question,
Yeah, but
leaves
you're
people feeling wanting, leaves that kind of hollow core, then it puts comprehensive liberalism as kind of the worst of both worlds in a lot of ways. Under the old neutralist model, should it have ever been successful, should it have ever existed in the first place, comprehensive liberalism is too elite, it's too contingent, it's too controversial, it posits too narrow a view of the good life and it demands control. So it can't work in that framework. And in the new world, this knuckle to knuckle clash of ideological conflict that you want to engage in, you want to fight, it can't provide people with the kinds of answers that they're looking for. It can't provide people with the kinds of social, concrete, social roles oriented guidance
See, but
that it
that is
seems like there's a lot of
it's the
hunger for.
premise I'm rejecting. It's the premise that both what people do want, what they need, what will be good for them, and what they are looking for is to be told what to do.
I think if
I
you can't look
think
around the world right now and see, at least really fear, at least really worry that what people really want, at least enough of them, at least a prohibitive blocking number of them, that what people really want is to be told what to do. If that seems wrong to you after everything we've seen over the last 10 years, then yes, I believe you are evaluating this situation we are in too optimistically.
I think there are people who will accept being told what to do if it means they get to tell other people what to do. I think that is the sort of through line of modern fascism. I think there are people for whom the good that they want to pursue is having social inferiors, always having someone beneath them. I think that is true of anti-feminism. I think that is true of certainly the racism of the Trump movement. Anti-Black racism is the core social cleavage of American society. I think it's true of economics. I think the fact that a lot of delivery workers were able to charge more for their time was seen as an insult to a lot of people. I think that's the through line more than I want to be told what to do. It's I want social inferiors, and very few people will say that. I took aim
Hmm.
at Chris Arnard in that
Yep.
article, who I will grant you is kind of a low version of this argument, right? But I found it interesting that he never said, I need to be told what to do. I
Yeah.
need a model of how to live. It's these other people, other men, men less educated, less intelligent than me. They need a guide. These poor slobs, and there's something
Yeah.
so patronizing about
Yeah.
Arnard,
And I
right?
just wanted to
These
plant my flag and say, I need to be told what to do. I am one of these people who I got a PhD, I did all this stuff, and I feel a very strong first personal urge to have a guidepost for what being a good man is that is
so
significantly
here's
thicker than
here's
what
my
liberalism can
challenge.
argue. And I think I'm in the majority on
So
that.
here's my challenge to you back. You're doing the thing. You're doing the thing where you take a very particular elite perspective of an educated, weird, in the acronym sense, person, of something that's in the back of your head in your life, and you project that onto an entire population of people who are not like you as an explanation for our total global political movement.
I mean, I've also talked to people, and I've also looked at some polling on this, and I've also looked at I've tried to ground this belief in the kinds of empirical anchors that one can have in an anecdotal politics and an anecdotal world.
Sure,
Um,
but I can
I come
cite
from a
data for
very
I can
I
cite
come from
data for my view as well.
oh, straight up. So we appeal to general plausibility, do we not? And when I and again, if I look at the world right now, I definitely see what you mean in terms of there are a lot of people who do want a face to stomp on.
But that's
Definitely.
it. That's the core impulse.
I am not
And I
confident
think,
on that. I think it is for the nastiest, the loudest, and the core
and let
cases.
me add something to that. That is the mechanism through which people are recruited into this ideology. In that, where do they start? When you're at the touchstone point of like getting drawn into like online conservative echo chambers, what we know what's drawing people in, and it's not stuff saying, oh, you're confused and lonely and you need to be told what to do. That actually comes later. The touchstone is something like transphobia. The touchstone, what initially draws you in is there's people with all these pronouns and it's weird and they're nasty and gross, right? I think the touchstone point for a lot of like the male stuff, it's framed in terms of male loneliness, but they almost never are providing concrete, much less useful advice. It's phrased in
Mm,
terms of hostility towards women. Most of
mm,
the things that draw people in are, if I were to boil it down, women don't know their place anymore. And I think it's
mm.
very easy to activate people like that, to sort of say that like the men before you had social inferiors, you should have social inferiors too. And I think that is what's being used to recruit people. Because, yeah, you watch some Jordan Peterson videos of him railing against pronouns. You get brought into Ben Shapiro, who will be railing against leftists more generally and provide you with a sort of more
Mm.
comprehensive intellectual framework for this. And then you'll get into the real sort of like white power stuff. I think like what has to be done there is to just sort of tell people they're wrong. Tell them that's not a nice or a
Boy,
healthy instinct to have, and that
I
they
don't
will
know,
make
man.
their own lives
Do
worse.
you think we spent the last 10 years doing too little naming and shaming on the progressive left? Do you
Fuck
think the
yes.
last Okay, so here's great. I love that you said that, and I think that you are so wrong. I think that strategy
I
was
think
heavily tried
the narrative of like
and
the backlash
heavily
to
gone.
woke is just thoroughly debunked at this point.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, we are. Yeah, this is one where I almost didn't go here because I knew that we were just going to be, Mars and Earth on this one, right?
Yeah.
Like it's such a different way of looking at things. Um, so
Let me
let me
go
turn.
first on this. So, I think the UK provides a really interesting case on this
Well,
one.
I almost don't want to go there because I do worry that we are just too far apart on that question. I'm trying to remember. You were hitting the point about um
Ultimately, let
needing,
me say a few things.
yeah.
Ultimately, I just don't really buy reaction narratives. The idea that fascism, I mean, now these are all
Yeah.
abstractions, right? But the
Mhm.
idea that liberalism or progressivism or social justice has done something which has provoked fascism, I just don't think makes a lot of sense intellectually. Fascism, as I have said, isn't a gentle movement with ideas and goals of its own. And, is this to say everything that was ever said by social justice was like, the most politically efficacious thing it could conceivably have been? No, there's plenty of stuff that I would have said differently. And certainly a lot of the jargon around, like, I don't know, intersectionality or cultural appropriation. I don't use that language. I've never used
Yeah.
that language. But I also don't think it's important. I think if we'd have used more accessible language, the result would have been the same. I think what we're looking at is an overwhelming propaganda push from the other side, not anything that we did to bait it. So I would give you an example from the UK of this actually, is we're known now in the UK as Turf Island, i.e. we're defined
Yeah.
trans people. But this is actually a very recent thing. In the
Yeah.
2017 election, every single one of our parties, including the then governing Conservative Party, ran on a platform of reforming the law to make it easier to transition. Every
Mhm.
single one, including Theresa May's Conservatives. There was this hadn't been an issue in our politics. It was something on which I think most people just didn't know what they thought at all, but there was a general sort of consensus, certainly at the elite level. It wasn't something, if you looked at the list of things people voted on, it wasn't on the list, much less it wasn't
Mhm.
list, right? It just wasn't a thing, right? And there were trans people. It's not like they suddenly invented themselves in 2018. So it wasn't a reaction. What happened? What happened is the number of negative articles about trans people in the British press went from 60 in 2012 to 1,000 in 2018 to over 7,500 in 2020. And then that
Mhm.
impacted into the rest of the political system and our politics. And I think the British case is useful because it's so much easier to pull out the causality there, is people weren't reacting to the existence of trans people. People weren't even reacting to the ways in which advocates for trans people were making the case on their behalf. They were reacting to an overwhelming top-down propaganda push telling them that these people were weird and needed to be opposed. And you see the same thing on immigration. Statistically, concerns about immigration correlate almost exactly with press coverage of it, not absolute numbers in any meaningful sense. This is something that has all come from the right. So my fuck yes in response to that question was not fuck yes, we needed to say intersectionality more, or we needed to
Yeah.
use obtuse terms more, or that everything we said was necessarily strategic and wise. It was when that propaganda push came, a lot of liberals, a lot of the sorts of liberals that you're defending, buckled down and just caved. They just went, oh, well, maybe we need to accommodate it. Oh, well, actually, trans people are a bit weird. Maybe they shouldn't be in sports. Maybe if we give a bit of ground, they'll let up. And my point is that was my fuck yes, is that was so delusional. There was
Mhm.
this belief among people, and I think it's not incidental that it was at least more common among neutral political liberals. There was this belief that if we appease them, if we just give a bit of ground politically, if we say, yes, you're right, liberalism was making you feel angsty. Yes, you're right, trans people are weird. Please, there's almost this begging. I'll give you what you want, please don't hurt me. And it didn't work. There was this theory again and again that the way to starve the wolf was by feeding it. And when the wolf just became stronger, the reaction was to feed it more. And we have run through that logic. When my position is critiqued, it is critiqued as if I was the one in power and I wasn't.
No.
The
Yeah.
type of
That's it.
liberals who wanted to fight, who wanted to do it my way, were the Democratic primary electorate, not the politicians. The people who have led us to this pass are the people who are now who have continually said to people like me, look at what you're doing to provoke this. And to which I say, we have not been the powerful people. We have not been the people in charge of liberalism. You have. Your strategy has led us to this pass. If you want people to look in the mirror, start with yourself.
I think it's really fascinating that you talk about identifying the start of trans backlash as the result of a top-down media push.
Yes.
When I talk to people and I ask them, because I know people that used to be like, man, born in a woman's body, what are you gonna do? I don't care that much, but it wasn't that salient to them. They talk about a top-down push too, but they talk about the kind of top-down cultural push for representation that was heavily driven through media institutions, through entertainment industry, the kind of stuff you sort of poo-pooed earlier as liberals' mere cultural hegemony, progressives' mere cultural hegemony on questions of entertainment and music. Entertainment and music are important. I
Agreed.
think
I'm not saying
I
liberal powers,
yeah,
but it's not hegemonic either.
and I guess what I maybe a way to draw out the difference between our two stories, because I have much more of the kind of typical wokeness happened story in my head, but where I think I try to be fairer than some of those people is you don't buy reaction narratives, and I kind of think it's all reaction narratives. Like I think that progressives, marginalized people, life for them in the 70s and 80s was not great. It was better than it was beforehand, but it was a bad situation. They experienced concrete political harms, and they went, where are a couple areas that we can get some foothold and push back against this? We can do it in media, we can do it in academia. Bam, bam. You have two big places of cultural control in American progressive cultural control in American culture. Then that produces a backlash, a feeling of hegemony, a sense that, there are times when I'll put my own cards on the table here. There are times when I will see a character from a marginalized background in a show or something like that. And I will roll my eyes, not because I don't want to see good trans stories, but because for so long, the appearance of that kind of character and that narrative property would precede a lecture, would precede a very didactic lesson, something out of an after school special about tolerance that I remembered from growing up in school in the 1990s. And here it is, getting what feels like pounded down my throat again and again and again. And if I, pretty squishy, kind of progressive libertarian-y guy, am feeling that. What about my friends from back home who were knocking around with a high school education and didn't even hear about any of this stuff until it suddenly showed up on their Netflix shows? I think that everybody feels like it's top down. I think that initial thing that gets people into reactionary politics isn't, I want people below me to step on. I think it gets there, believe me, for some people. But I think the initial thing that brings people in is that sense of fear. You talk about begging, please don't hurt me. I think that is across the political spectrum. Now, you can say, based on the underlying empirical facts, one side has more reason to fear being crushed than the other. But I have kind of grown exhausted of that argument. I've kind of grown exhausted. Who cares what the underlying facts are? Who cares whether or not these fears are reasonable on one side or unreasonable on the other? Like you said, we can't argue with these people about reason. We can't argue with rationality on this question. What we have is a system where, and I appeal to the kind of classic polarization literature examples on this in my dissertation to bring some, actual empirical political science on the question. What we have is a cycle of fear, a cycle of escalating polarization, and a cycle where everybody feels like they are outnumbered. And I think my theoretical approach can at least root something like broad neutralist concerns very
To which I
broad
go, so cool,
into
why didn't
fear.
it work? Like,
Because, my friend, because
so,
real neutralism has never been tried.
okay.
Because I
Real
question your
neutralism,
premise
because
about
real
the
neutralism can't be tried. Like
yes, I because of the kind of
the
thing I
best
talk
it
about in my
can
article, the
do
political
is
comprehensive
have
collapse. Yeah.
the best it can do is to have the driving seat of the Liberal coalition, which it has had for 20 years now, and we see the result. Like, if there's some theoretically better version, great. but it is the one who's been in charge, and its strategy is the one that has failed. Now, to the point about
Oh
culture,
boy.
what I'd want to point out is let's be clear about just how one-sided and one way these reaction narratives run. It never runs the other way, right?
And I'm going to agree with you on that.
So even with respect to media, which I've said is possibly a liberal domain, I could tell a
Possibly.
story about conservative cultural hegemony in movies. I could say, let me pick an example. Okay, great. We've had a lot of debates about policing, right, and excessive use of force by police. I'd argue a lot of the assumptions that Americans bring to the table about that come from the media they've consumed. All the movies in my childhood had an image of a hero cop who was unduly held back by bureaucracy and just needed to go out there. Every Mel Gibson movie, right? Who
Mhm.
needed to just go out there
Death Wish.
and be the sort of man of violence,
Mhm.
right? In a way that is an overtly conservative narrative about what policing should be in state power, in a way that is, to use your words, rammed down your throat every bit as overtly, with every bit as much looking at the camera lectures about overtly political topics as anything that has ever been done about minority representation. You will literally get characters in these movies turning to the camera and complaining about pencil pushers and bureaucracy and too many regulations on police, right? Now, does anyone, and I mean anyone, ever say, well, I'm a communist because of that and I want to destroy free society? Maybe some people do,
I don't think they say that, but I do
but
think there
what
was a
never
long here of
but what
progressive
never
media
happens
criticism
is
that was
people
built into script writing and that led to a change in Hollywood, that led to more progressive productions being made, that led to the high progressive liberalism in art media of the 2010. Like again, I don't think this story is common enough, but I think I say it and I think it's true.
But I think to sort of cap out my point, I think we're always asked to feel sympathy and understanding for people drifting right in a way that we're never asked to feel for them drifting left. We're asked to say, okay, but look, you have to understand. When they're seeing all these trans people on TV, and it is kind of annoying, in a way where explanation fades into excuse. We never do the same the other way. We never say there's been this dominant narrative in movies about how police should behave, and people have not liked having that politics pushed down their throat, and they've drifted left in a way that we're kind of empathizing with that person. Neutralist liberalism never does that. It only ever does it to its right, and I find that unidirectionality really suspect. But more than that, I just don't think the narrative is true. If you look at what people think liberals are saying about gender identity and so on, they are not getting their information on that from liberals. They are getting their information on that by and large from conservative news sources. Like I hear regularly about how, oh, liberals think there's 72 genders. This is not a claim even the most out there social justice people have ever made. It starts with a meme in conservative spheres, right? And it is now a regular talking point. And this is what I really wish people could sort of understand is it's not that people are seeing liberals or social justice people or democratic politicians and having a reaction against them. To the extent that they are seeing them curated through right-wing media sources, be it, the
Mhm.
Daily Wire or more conservative media, and having reaction to how they're presented there. Now, if you ask that person, they will say, oh, well, it's liberals, they said this. But it isn't. It's how liberals have been presented to them. And that's sort of what we have to break. Yes, this is, and I think the example of the UK case really brings this home. Absolutely no one, I mean, deeply no one gave a shit about trans people in this country until there was a sustained top-down media push against it. Then it became a thing.
I mean, this is kind of why I didn't want to go down this path because I don't exactly know where to begin with someone who thinks the media of the last 10 years, news media or entertainment media, was insufficiently liberal or too quiet about their liberalism. Yeah, I could just as easily throw back numbers to you. I saw somebody break down, again, someone making an argument like yours. I saw somebody break down, I think it was Freddie DeBoer, actually, who I'm sure you don't have a lot of love for, but he broke down like how many of the New York Times, and you've taken aim at the New York Times yourself, how many of their op-ed pieces were either angled against Trump or heavily, explicitly against Trump, and how few were pro-Trump. If you really believe that the strategy that we need to pursue going forward is to double down on progressive media control. I also did look it up. There is a headline in the piece that you posted. No king shows our power when we have messaging reach. One of the headers is a louder liberalism. You do want to
Okay,
be louder. You do want
yeah,
to say what you're saying. It ain't the message, it's the volume. We need to, we need nothing about our liberal message that
it's
more of
both,
our
I
liberal
guess.
message won't fix. Yeah. Um, then the appeal that I can only make to someone who can, if I'm going to be a little uncharitable for a second, ignore the countervailing evidence to that point, would be, do we then not need some kind of a plan if that doesn't work? Do we then not need, because there are, it's not like the only options in front of us are loud liberalism, shout it from the rooftops,
Okay, so go on then.
or immediate
What's the
incipient
plan?
fascism. The plan, I think, following Horowitz, following you know, the Ostroms, following a wide range of following Catholic subsidiarity theorists, there is a version of this following to a certain extent Chandran Kukathas. Devolution of power can do a lot. Giving people quarantining these conflicts into subnational units. The most relevant one in the United States are states, obviously. But there are other things. I talk heavily about sort of indigenous groups and their territorial rights, what
Mhm.
they want to see. I analyze indigenous theorists and the kind of economic policies they want to engage in on indigenous land, which are deeply in contravention of the Interstate Commerce Clause and a whole bunch of stuff that I get into. But the long story short is there is actual historical precedent. Malaysia, I think, is the one that Horowitz talks about the most, but there's actual historical precedent for quarantining really nasty issues that had the potential to become complete top down up struggles for the state and then enforcing your worldview from the top oppressive situations and quarantining those conflicts within subnational units such that at least the liberal mode of life is preserved somewhere, at least the possibility of people being able to move to California and be more themselves. And there is a long history in the United States of people moving to California to be more themselves, whatever that means. Often it meant gay, right? But a wide range of things. That is a model that can work even in a situation as bad as the situation we're in right now.
And
If I am
how will we
correct,
not have that?
because what you've seen in a lot of cases is, particularly under the Warren Court era, you saw the expansion of a lot of constitutional interpretation to remove issues from state control. Some of these were dead necessary. Don't get me wrong about questions like segregation. Don't get me wrong about, questions in that vein.
But so
But
then
a
what are
why
you talking about? Like people say, oh, the Warren Court, and then that was an overreach and conservatism was a backlash. To what? Integrated schools to bodily autonomy? Like,
I mean, well, obviously abortion it was a very key issue that didn't go away. That's one of the main examples that I pull up for a kind of moral issue that is not going to vanish even when you get control of the state, even when you get control of all three branches, even when you educate against it, right? People had a core moral intuition
and I mean,
about that.
abortion would be my prime case as to why neutral liberalism is sort of just never going to work.
And the question isn't neutralist liberalism of the Rawlsian variety, right? That
Wolf
envisioned a
is
kind
famously
of,
unable to answer that one.
yeah, exactly. No. And like Kevin Valier said when he was on your episode, it's a particularly hard case for public reason liberalism because public reason liberalism tells you how to treat people. It doesn't tell you how to count who's a person and who's not.
And my point
That's
is that's kind of a defeater for that position generally, because it's not just that that case shows why it doesn't work in that case shows why it doesn't work at all, because to apply a creed neutrally, you have to know the set of things that you're applying it to, and then almost by its own admission, it doesn't and can't.
See, and I don't, I look at that more like, what theory are you going to have of politics that doesn't have a bad, nasty outlier, right? Like that is, or a bad, nasty defeater looking
That's a
thing.
pretty rough
I,
beater.
and so the kind of neutralist liberalism, if I'm arguing for a kind of neutralist
Yeah.
liberalism, it is explicitly to bring back the kind of Rawlsian political philosophy language into it. It's under a modus vivendi circumstance. We are not asking people to come together for what I believe is you think political liberalism is too low a bar. I think it has, or too low a bar. I think it has too high a bar, right? It asks people to believe in stability for the right reasons and to buy into a centralized conception of justice, an overarching conception of justice with the parts of their, reasonable comprehensive doctrines that match with that.
So do
And
you
my
think,
stance,
so do you think if we had less liberal influence in media, movies, and TV, and if, let us just say, Roe v. Wade had never happened, that was just left up to the states, that just gets us off this track?
I think the liberalism TV and movies, it was me trying to tell something like a story for why comprehensive liberalism has had more influence than you think it has. I would say the core question is how many issues are brought off the table constitutionally, the political table, how and what aren't. When you actually have gone through it, when you read the far rightists, I read Patrick Deneen and Adrian Vermeule, so we're not talking like milk toast characters here. We're talking far right
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
And then on the left, I read Glenn Coulthard, major Canadian Indigenous theorist, and Leanne Betesamasage Simpson, another major Canadian Indigenous theorist. They have challenges to the constitutional system. They have asks that are pretty rough. I list some of them in my dissertation. An example being, certain aspects of the First Amendment that have been structured very strongly to feature church and state separation. That's something that the right really doesn't want and really wants to erode. On the left, elements of the Constitution around, like I said, the Interstate Commerce Clause that prevents them from banning certain kinds of economic activity within their borders that they believe is too environmentally deleterious or too deleterious to their traditional modes of life and ways of being, their indigenous life ways. Those are ruled out constitutionally. I think that reconstitutionalizing some of those issues, relying less on that kind of Warren Court model of, okay, we have analyzed this, we've taken this issue, we've moved it permanently off the table, that is no longer up for political contestation. That has been a major driver of polarization, that I argue. And I think one example where you've seen on the abortion issue a depolarization is you don't know how depolarized people are until they have a chance to vote on things. If I had asked you prior to Roe v. Wade being overturned, what are the odds that Kansas was going to vote to keep some form of abortion legal? Maybe you were more politically engaged than many of the progressives I talked to, but if I asked most of the progressives I know, they would assume that everyone in Kansas was an anti-abortion, dead set, rock-ribbed, evangelical Christian, and it turned out that wasn't the case. The minute they had a chance to actually engage in politics on the question, we learned that those people over there aren't quite as scary as they originally seemed back when our walls were so strongly up. So I do think that over constitutionalization of questions, moving too many questions off the political table, has had a deleterious effect for political polarization. And I believe, and you see this as a move under the Supreme Court right now, this was explicitly Kavanaugh's argument for why he ruled the way he did in Dobbs, you know, taking that issue off the table, taking the issue out of constitutional realm and putting it back in the democratic realm, back in the realm where people can
Do you
actually vote
think
on and
do
engage
you
in
think Dobbs
policy.
was a good decision? You agree with that?
I believe in I believe that a woman should be able to control her body in any state that I lived in. I would push heavily and have
But
pushed.
you'd abandon that right in red states.
I would, yeah, it was one of those issues upon which this is where maybe I am begging and maybe I am going, oh God, please don't hurt me. But there's a lot of them and they outnumber us, man. There's
But
there's a
rightly
lot of
so,
those
though, as
non.
you've just said. We're the
And that,
majority view on that, and we
yes,
always have been.
that's a good way. Let me put it this way. That is one nice element of the Dobbs decision that came out that I didn't fully anticipate. On other questions, on the general kind of liberal approach to life to bring things to a kind of more foggy place, because we haven't been doing this for a little bit. Apologies. The When I look out and I look at the demands that people have, and I look at people's actual felt political opinions, the things that they care the most about, I do not see a public that is on board with any kind of liberalism, comprehensive or political. And
I
I am
see a
hoping
liberalism.
that they
Sorry, finish your point.
I am hoping that by quarantining some of those, I argue we need to maintain freedom of movement. I argue we need to maintain um, certain economic baselines for people. My kind of theoretical trick is I draw that out of non-liberal thinkers, hoping that if you ground it in non-liberalism, non-liberals will find those appeals a bit more, morally concomitant. That's the theoretical approach. But the long story short of it is, we're a confederation of states. We are a group of individual self-governing units. There's been this model, Donald Horowitz calls it scaling up federalism, where the idea is we have the laboratories of democracy until we find the right answer. Then we take that right answer, we plug it into the federal government, and force all 50 states to work along with that. That is not how the country was meant to work. I think we are reaping the negative benefits of that right now. And I think devolution, while having its own problems, and we can talk about that, is another lever that we can pull that doesn't rely on doubling down on the strategies that you are tied to and which I think have already been tried and do not work.
But your strategy, but again, my position is not the one that's been in the driver's seat. And you've said tried and not
And
worked.
I
We
just really
we
disagree
we
with you on that.
we just had Dobbs. We had it for quite some time now. If that was something that was going to take the heat out of the room, that didn't work, did it?
I think these things take a little longer to work out than that. I think that what we're seeing from the Supreme Court is a push to decentralize, is a decentralizing bias, except a few areas we can talk about. I don't like the decisions on presidential power, for instance. I think that that is going in the wrong direction.
Just
But
sticking with Dobbs, we're much more polarized now, even than we were at the point of that decision.
but it seems to have decreased in salience, certainly. Like it didn't drive election outcomes nearly as much as we thought it was going to on the left.
Well, we're balkanized into tribes, but if the problem specifically is polarization, which you could measure by all sorts of statistical means, polarization is higher now than at the time of Dobbs.
But is it higher around abortion? Again, has abortion been, this is another question, like, has abortion been made less salient as a cross-cutting national issue? I think it kind of very clearly has. And I think that is an area where we need to move more issues
Still very
to
high
move
in the
things.
list of things people vote on. It's just voting on in a different way. Instead of voting for someone who'll nominate Supreme Court justices, we're voting for people who'll implement it directly, but it's still a voting issue. And again, we're more polarized. We're more angry at each other. We're more in danger of fascism now than we were. When was Dobbs? It was mid-Biden presidency. So even 4 or 5 years ago, we were in a considerably worse place. And look, you can say, oh, well, you liberals, like, there's you comprehensive liberals wrote this school board guidance or like had a trans person on TV. The Supreme Court has done what you wanted them to do, and it has not worked.
I would say, certainly, if you don't believe the last 10 years was enough time for comprehensive liberalism to have a meaningful effect, I certainly don't think that the that the moves we've made since the Roberts Court took full shape. The very few stuttering moves we're making towards decentralization, and which we're increasingly making, again, who's the biggest challenge to Texas right now with their redistricting malarkey? It's been Gavin Newsom in California. He's running it, he's leading that charge from a state position. He's obviously got national level ambitions, but we are seeing, I argue, a shift towards a more decentralized, more state oriented understanding of politics. And I believe not in a final political victory, because you're right, there is no final political victory. There are more and less stable political equilibria that we can reach. And the political equilibrium that we have been engaging in, I think, for too long, where there is a powerful federal central government
Mm.
that is wedded to and has increasingly delegated authority to a powerful judicial branch that has removed more and more areas that people want to legislate on from meaningful democratic contestation. That is the circumstance that has been set in not for the last 10 years, but for the last 60, 70, 80. And that it will take 60, 70, 80 years of decentralization to undo that and undo the negative consequences of polarization. There's a great term from an article I cite in the dissertation. Um, Let me look that up really quickly because I feel bad because he's correct. Tornberg. Tornberg talks about this. There is a dimensionality reduction, he calls it, where individual groups and individual geographical locations have different issues that they would consider more salient to their question at the time. Environmental issues are major in Oregon on both sides, left and right. The left because they want to protect the beautiful land we have around us, and the right because a major industry in Oregon was logging, and a lot of environmental concerns and pushes dealt with that. Now, that has been subsumed into a larger environmental conversation about climate change that has a very clear left right valence that everybody in the country winds up falling on under conditions of dimensionality reduction, and which doesn't actually serve the debate that Oregonians specifically want to have about the environment. Tornberg argues that breaking up this dimensionality reduction would go a long way towards alleviating the kind of ratcheting up of polarization and ratcheting up of cross-national tensions and the need to hit you to get the top position and attack from the top position, top-down control of the kind that you're just like, that's what politics is. We just need to fight that fight. And I see another way out of that takes seriously, I think more seriously, the entrenched forms of illiberal sentiment and non-liberal sentiment that exist right now. I think, long story short, if you go into that fight for top-down control of the state, everybody coerces, so let's do it, let's advocate for it, let's have our turn at the. I think you lose that fight. Your worldview just is not popular enough to make it work. For whatever reason, I don't need to tell you a deep Malaise story. And under those conditions, I'm going, we have another way out of this. It's going to be ugly. There are going to be casualties. Those are going to be real problems. But compared to what, I think your strategy is a non-starter from the beginning, given how far we've gone down the road, the slippery slope
But
towards
again,
non-liberalism, illiberalism, fascism, if you want to call it that.
you talk as if my strategy has been what has been governing the liberal response to this, and it just isn't. Like my whole project is a critique of how our team has defended itself. And again, I challenge you to point to a single exercise of power that comprehensive liberals have made that gets anywhere near the Dobbs decision, right? Like
Wouldn't
we
it be
have been
Roe?
we have been within the Trump era. Like,
Well, the Trump era has been guided mainly by Trump, right? And then
yeah, but
by like the Trump era,
on I'll
if
say
it's
on
happening the
this
Trump
has
era.
been on this has been played according to a liberalism that we have generally been ruled by a liberalism that wants to find common ground since at least the Obama era. And I think from my side of the aisle, your that perspective just seems hopelessly naive. It seems like you're taking people at their word who are very, very clearly arguing and obviously arguing in bad faith, either at the Vermeulen level or at the level of what, the core MAGA base
Mhm.
says, in that, we can have a debate about what the correct level of federalism is. And I think that's complicated, and I don't have actually I can, or at the level of like, at what point do democratic inputs override liberal rights? At what point do rights override democratic inputs? That's an interesting debate. And I'm not even necessarily saying it's wrong to have more federalism or more democratic impulse. I'm saying that's not a solution. Like, if it was a solution, it would have worked by now. Like, if Dobbs was going to take the air out of the room, we would have. If okay, it's going to take 60 years. One, we don't have 60 years, right? We maybe have another four before we have full fascism. If it wasn't showing some positive effects by now, then I'm sorry, I'm not sold on it. Like, if it didn't at least take the heat out of the room a bit, it's ratcheted up the tension knobs. If we haven't seen the results by now, then sorry, you're not selling me on it. But also, it seems like when the Conservatives say, oh, our concern is states' rights, that was always, always, always coded language for Jim Crow. And it seems like there's something hopelessly naive to say, oh, well, yeah, if we just gave the Conservatives what they want on states' rights, if we just, in the Obama era, it was the Tea Party talking about the national debt. And one of the things I loved, one of my favorite quotes of the Trump era was, I think it was Mulvaney, it was one of the Trump people, when someone was asked about the impact on the national debt, said, and I quote, no one gives a shit about that, end
Yeah, right.
quote. And I just love that because, of course, they don't. Of
Mm.
course, that concern was never sincere. And we see it now, right? Like, is the concern, oh, we want the states to be more diverse and to be laboratories of democracy, as the main thing the federal government is doing is sending troops into blue states as a show of force, right? Like, of course, their concerns aren't sincere. And the entire project of which not only you are seeming an adherent, but has a lot of intellectual traction with smart people and seems to motivate the decisions of powerful people, is to take these transparently bad faith arguments as if they were sincere.
I think so. The first thing I want to say, as regards federalism, as regards it hasn't worked, as regards we're in too dire a circumstance for it to work. Maybe you can accuse me of doing something similar to what I accused you of earlier, of trying to get in this exact sweet spot of things are just bad enough to where you have to agree with me, but not so bad to where it rules out my approach. But there's a good line from Eleanor Ostrom, and she said, anything that works in practice has to work in theory. And what we have seen through the federalisms, he particularly brings up, Horowitz particularly brings up the cases of Malaysia, Nigeria, and India. Now, India, it's got its problems, right? Of course. But we have seen, you talk about the people trying to appease these people who are obviously arguing in bad faith. The people in these countries dealing with deeply ethnically divided societies either definitely had politicians who were arguing in bad faith, or they were arguing in good faith and simply saying truly abhorrent things. And we saw federalism used in those examples to meaningfully ratchet down ethnic tensions, to meaningfully ratchet down ethnic polarization, and to meaningfully, not to the extent that we would be maybe satisfied with in our own countries, but certainly a great improvement vis-a-vis where they were beforehand, to support broadly liberal institutions and broadly liberal structures of governance. There really is an element where I believe if it can work there on the much more contentious issues of divided ethnic societies, then it certainly is a strategy worth pursuing here, especially given, and this is a core area of disagreement I don't think we're going to solve, especially given the overall failure of autonomy-oriented liberalism to field a successful political argument over the last 10 years. It wasn't your people. We just disagree on that. I argue that a lot of the core underlying moral impetus under wokeness and under the kinds of elements of the leftward cultural swing that we saw over the last 10 years was fundamentally about pursuing autonomy as a ground moral core to it. Tried that, didn't work. We tried the Rawlsian neutral. Where we agree is we also tried the Rawlsian neutralism thing like that before in the Kumbaya 90s. That also didn't work. It seems to, I think one of the reasons for that in the paper that I sent you is because the political liberalism often devolved in practice into supporting comprehensive liberalism, a story I'm sure you don't agree with, given the nature that you.
I think what you're showing there is the two aren't fully separable. I mean, this is a separate conversation. I think you're showing
Yeah.
that you can't get a clean divide. But I think we just take that in different directions. My thought is, so why even try?
And I kind of go, yeah, so why even try in that sense? But then I have a different set of arguments against why not to try your position that we know we disagree on. If your listeners agree with the broad strokes of my characterization, if they agree with at least the core argument that things are bad enough, that liberalism is unpopular enough, that the damage to underlying liberal sensations and feelings and shared premises in the population is bad enough. I'm telling them there is another way out other than pure knuckle breaking fight for the top. And I'm saying we better hope there is because we probably lose that fight because things are probably just that bad. You might not think we're there yet. I do to that extent. I do to that extent believe that liberalism maybe not as a governing institution. I think it does have several concrete advantages as a set of governing institutions. The utility of those governing advantages, basic prosperity, all that kind of stuff that people talk about, that will maintain an edge for liberalism that other ideologies and approaches won't have. But in terms of felt sentiment among the population, maybe that was always an outlier if it ever existed in the first place. Maybe the feelings that people had in favor of autonomy or neutralism, both of those are historical exemptions. And I wanted to create a theory and a political approach that was robust to that possibility. I wanted to create a political like the most charitable way, the way I ultimately sell my work to someone who looks at the world like you is maybe you're correct. I kind of hope you are on some level for as strongly as I pushed against it today. I kind of, I'm as a neutralist myself, I sort of wish the neutralist would have carried the day. As a person with neutralist sympathies, I should say. Um, but boy, would I prefer a comprehensive liberal over the other alternatives I see out there. Gosh, yes. If it's going to be a knuckle to knuckle fight for dominion. But if you're wrong, if things are bad enough, if things are as bad as they sometimes look in the polling data, if things are as bad enough as people's guts sometimes say they are, looking out and seeing the kind of liberal anime that you question, then we better have a backup plan. We better have break glass in case of institutional emergency. And my pretty radical form of decentralization, I'll admit, it requires a lot of sacrifices from the current liberal status quo that I wish we could otherwise maintain. But retreat and retrenchment is a strategy if you're getting your butt whooped. And at least I feel like I've been getting my butt whooped for 10 years now, 20 years now. That's that's where I want to land at the end of the day. Even if you are substantively right, it feels like we do need a backup plan. And that's the work I've been trying to do since day one of my intellectual life, really.
But does that reconcile then? Let me say a few things to surmise my position, and then I'll let you have the last word.
Okay.
I think there's a fundamental framing difference between myself and someone, possibly in your position, but certainly say like Kevin Valier, right? And I like Kevin,
Mm.
but in terms
Yes.
of the problems we see ourselves trying to solve, right?
Mm.
And then I think to someone like Kevin, he sees the fundamental problem he's trying to solve as polarization. I see
Mm.
the fundamental problem I'm trying to solve as fascism. And I think
Yeah.
that's just a foundationally different way of looking at the world. Retreat and retrenchment is sometimes a strategy. From my perspective, I feel like that is the strategy we have been pursuing since before the Trump era. I feel like the entire Obama presidency was an attempt to re-establish cultural consensus and common ground through the power of presidential rhetoric alone, and it was obviously a failure.
Mm.
And also, not just theoretically, but substantively. Maybe if we really work with you on immigration and deportations, we can find a deal on that. Maybe if we really, give ground on the budget, we can come to a grand bargain. And we've seen the fruits of that strategy. Dobbs wasn't a concession, no liberal chose to give it up, but nonetheless it was the result, and nonetheless it hasn't worked to take air out of the room. I think where a lot of people are coming from, I think where the Democratic primary electorate are coming from, and I think broadly they're correct. I think it's an emotional instinct that then gets rationalized, but that doesn't mean it's wrong.
Yeah.
We have we have had one strategy, which is retreat and retrenchment. And then as soon as that retrenched position gets advanced upon, then we do the same again. Our gut impulse is we want to stand and fight. We don't know that
Mhm.
we'll win, but we want to try and hold a position, not always be retreating. We want to fight. And ideally, we want to go on the offensive. We want to take the fight to the enemy. Now, we are in quite a weak position to do that, but that is what we want to do. And you say, you hope we win. Yeah. And obviously the sentiment is shared. Obviously, I would prefer a neutral liberalism, the liberalism of the 90s, the liberalism of Bill Clinton or,
Yeah.
Tony Blair to the alternative for all of my issues with it. Um, so I guess to put it at the level of just abstract military metaphors, say, yeah, sure, have a plan B if we fail. If we fail to hold this position, if we fight our ground and fail, which we may well, then we will just simply have to give more ground. We will have to surrender more territory. But I think the people on my side of it, who may not be a majority of the electorate, but they are certainly a majority of the left side of the electorate,
Yes.
of the people who might conceivably be oppose this, which is half the country,
Hmm.
this is the majority view. Can we please fight? If we lose, we'll have to give ground anyway. We'll go to your
Hmm.
plan B, but can we please stand and fight? That's where we're
Yeah.
at.
And to bring it back to the theorist's beloved John Rawls, where I think the terminology of modus vivendi comes in useful here, where I think is going all the way back to the start of the discussion, where I think recognizing what he called a failure mode, a situation where people are just fighting for the best situation that they can get given the resources at their disposal and the facts on the ground, right? The advantage of looking at politics under that lens is it allows for that kind of attitude. I don't have to look at you and say, I can look at you and say, I think that's a bad strategy under the circumstances. I can look at you and say, I think you are bound to be disappointed down the line. But a modus vivendi scrum is a scrum. It's a nasty fight. People really get passionate. People really care about going out there and speaking full-throatedly for what they believe in, and maybe even using some underhanded tactics here and there, are tactics that used to be considered underhanded, but then they used it, so we better darn well. All that kind of stuff can happen under a modus vivendi because we're just going for the best thing we can. Where the test of our particular views, where I think there's one thing that's happening already, which is it seems to me increasingly this fight is happening on the state by state level. It seems increasingly that you're seeing more aggressive, certainly progressive states engaging in the kinds of actions against the federal government that previously red states have used before that. You could argue they were maybe modeling on sanctuary cities before that and sanctuary states before that. And on the marijuana, the great marijuana defection, where we just kind of said, no, we don't believe in that particular scheduling of the DA or the, anymore, all that. But for whatever reason, we are seeing an increase. This is fighting out on the state by state level. Your attitude will absolutely be necessary to protect the spaces of autonomy oriented progressivism and autonomy oriented liberalism that exist nowadays in the United States. And they do exist. There are states that frame, even in their constitutions, that way sometimes. The test between our views is will you be able to mobilize enough people to, once you've protected your territory, and I think you got a good chance of protecting California. I think you got a good chance of protecting Oregon and Washington, right? Just to speak to the area I know the best. Once you've done that, once you successfully defended your territory, are you able to mobilize people to recapture their territory, to capture red territory, to use the very broad, very low bandwidth metaphor? If at that point you see the mobilization start to drop off. If at that point people start going, as I predict they will, you know, I'm happy here in Oregon. You got my progressive policies that I want here in Oregon. I feel bad for those people in Texas that can't get an abortion, but not enough to start to carry this fight all the way through. Not enough to risk losing what I've got right now. If that happens, if enough people happen such that your forward momentum stalls in your fight, that is the sign that a new modus vivendi has been reached. That is the sign that a new coordination point has been reached. A coordination point based more on decentralization, a coordination point based more on the kinds of approach that you see popular in many of the Supreme Court decisions right now. That will be the ultimate test, I think, maybe is a nice way to leave this, a prediction. Are you able to get enough people together in defense of an autonomy oriented liberalism to make that the law of the land everywhere in the land to a much greater extent than it is right now? Or do people at some point go, you know what? I've got my territory. I feel safe here, and I don't want to risk this settlement. That's the question. It's an open empirical question. And I think the trends are cutting in my direction on that. And I think the underlying ideological balance of the population and biases of the population is cutting in favor of that. You might disagree, but I think that's the test.
I think that's just one step ahead of where we are.
How so?
Well, okay, so we spent a lot of time, but like, fine. I kind of like defending my views under fire because, like, I think it can get you clear on stuff and it can also send you a way to think about stuff. Like I say, I think right now we are in a battle for control of the state, and I mean both at the federal and national level. Now,
Mm,
as a result of that fight, is one possible outcome sort of a stalemate along the lines that you describe?
mm,
Yeah, that's one possible outcome. And then what will happen then? You know,
History.
yeah, yeah.
Just keeps
History goes
happening.
on, right? I also think a sort of total national victory is another set of outcomes that are on the table. And I honestly, my gut is that that is more likely. That one side just wins at the national level and imposes their will down. At the moment, certainly, it's looking like a total national victory for the fascists, is sort of the outcome we're trending towards. And yes, Gavin Newsom's fighting in California, and certainly I agree with his push to gerrymander the state. But it's possible that he will just lose, right? That will get struck down in court and will go into the midterms with a very rigged system in favor of the Republicans and will sort of phase into competitive authoritarianism proper, right?
Mhm.
That's certainly an outcome, but also all the points I made about contingency, you don't know what's happening. Sometimes
Mhm.
stuff just falls apart. And certainly, when you look at who's leading the other side, these are not necessarily stable people, to put it mildly. I think the possibility of unforced errors must be rated quite high. That's not a
As
strategy.
someone once said, they're not sending their best.
Yeah. So, I think that the idea of, say, we get democratic control of the federal government and they start doing things I would advocate, like packing the court and so on, you would still be left with a reasonable, I think even in my most extreme vision, you would still be left with a reasonable amount of autonomy in red states, but I think probably not close to what you're asking for, where like abortion
Mhm.
would be state by state. I think that's another option. So you've got three possibilities there of seizing the state from one side or the other, or a sort of stalemate. Stalemate's possible. My feeling is it's probably the least likely. Uh,
Interesting.
Now, if we were to reach that point, and again, my feeling is that's actually the least likely of the three. If we were to reach that point, I think you're probably correct that if liberals were able to get to the point where we felt like our blue states were secure, which right now we certainly don't, right?
No.
Um, then I think you're probably right that there would be I wouldn't even put it in terms of failure to persuade. I think there'd probably be a sort of war fatigue. I think people would,
Yeah.
a bit like what happened when we sort of went with Reconstruction of like, look, we fought a civil war. We just want to live together again, and we don't want to be
Yeah.
occupying red states, and we're just done with this, right? I think there would be that kind of moment. Now, when that debate comes, I think you and I will definitely be on other sides of it because one of the core positions that has emerged out of my sort of liberalism is a historical revisionism that abandoning Reconstruction was a mistake.
Yeah,
And
of
that
course.
everything that's gone wrong in America can really be traced back to that.
Yeah, sure,
We
of course.
should have imposed an equal rights regime on the South by force. And that, as much as like anything else, was what is wrong with the modern constitutional system. So I think if we get to that point, but I agree it will be harder to mobilize people to go on the offensive because I think there will be a war fatigue. Um, I think my position there is we will get to that outcome if it happens. And like I say, I'm not convinced that's the most likely option. I think the most likely option is just a top-down victory from one side or the other. That just seems structurally where we're going. And
Yeah.
so, my position is let's at the very least, let's all come together to resist a top-down victory from the fascists. Let's all be allied in that much. Because one of the
Yeah.
challenges of our era is not just rising fascism, it's that the people who don't want that are very divided on why this has happened, what we are to do about it, both at the level of values and strategy, and what sort of world we want to build after, right? I think where
Hmm.
I can accept a modus vivendi, and maybe we can end with this as a point of at least potential agreement, where
Yeah.
I can accept a modus vivendi is maybe we don't need to agree on all of those things and resolve all of those things in order to fight the thing that we all agree is the worst case scenario. You know
Yeah.
what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I think the difference in
I'm
framing,
going to
which
have my
doesn't,
point of view. I'm going to argue it. I have, right?
yeah,
You've argued yours, but like maybe the thing that can unite this smaller and let's be honest, sadder overlapping consensus is we don't want fascism.
yes, no, I would go with that. The the modification I would make would be, I think the order of likelihood is total fascist takeover,
Yeah.
stalemate or deal, comprehensive liberal victory. I think again, I could probably quibble with the fascism narrative to a certain extent, though really not that much. I would compare him less to Hitler and more to, you know, Pinochet or Perón is kind of the area that I would put him in. But it's all authoritarianism, right? It's all bad. In that world, if that's the rank ordering, total authoritarian takeover, some kind of stalemate, states' rights stalemate, total progressive victory. I would ask if you start seeing moves towards that look like the formation of a state by state modus vivendi that might be more defensible than total victory. If you see what we're going to see, which is blue states becoming much more assertive about, what we're already seeing, much more assertive about pushing back on federal mandates and pushing back on what
What's
they
your
argue are
preference?
Trump's unconstitutional put. My preference,
Not likelihood, preference. Because I'm
um,
obviously comprehensive liberalism, state by
yeah,
state fascism.
uh, an enlightened republic ruled by nine Neil Gorsuches. I don't know. Like I'm a libertarian. I have real unpopular political views. That's part of the reason why I wound up with this theory that assumes loss all the time, is because all I've done my entire political life is lose. All I've seen is people get more authoritarian left and right across the board. And so, what would I prefer? I would prefer something that we haven't even talked about because I know it's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about you're a smaller
Like,
percent of the population than you claim, may be true of varying sorts of liberals, political and comprehensive. That is certainly true of libertarians.
oh yeah, no, we're
Right.
nobody. And so, like, the line I've been using lately is,
It sounds like your preference ordering is modus vivendi, comprehensive liberalism, fascism.
I guess, because maybe under the modus vivendi, I don't know, like the way I put it when it's a competition between the progressives and the fascists, the way I kind of put it from my right wing stance is it's like if I have a choice between socialists and racist socialists, I
Yeah.
will go with the socialists every day of the week. Right? Like that's not a question for
Yeah.
me. But at least under a modus vivendi, at least under the kind of decentralized modus vivendi that I try to sketch, I think there is a morally valuable capacity that allows more people to live under regimes that more closely match their normative worldview than is currently possible under our top down system. That is a positive value of the modus vivendi system that the two top down scenarios that are most likely don't contain. So, gun to my head right now, the mood you got me in, I would say, yeah, I think the modus vivendi is preferable, acknowledging that a lot of people will be left by the wayside, and a lot of people on both sides of the political spectrum will have to give up core elements and things that they care about under the old model of viewing the US as a cohesive body on which one enforces one's views from a top down perspective.
I think getting those three options is a good clarifier of the differences between us because it's both
Hmm.
practical and values
Yeah.
wise. Like, and I mean, to be clear, when I talk about a top-down victory, I'm not talking about federal troops coming in and forcing everyone to go to a university and attend a queer studies major.
No.
Not yet, anyway, I joke. But
Yeah. Right.
um, I am talking about federal rights like abortion and so
Yeah.
on. And I would, I would leave a certain amount up to the states. I think I think our old constitutional order is gone. What comes next will have to be new, but it will, I think, have to be new with reference to the old modes and orders. It will have to at least draw inspiration from them. I don't, what I don't think, but I think the reason I think some sort of top down, just to use that language, by again, which I don't mean full on control, I mean like Warren Court, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think is most likely is two things. One, the fascists won't settle for anything else. Now, maybe they would be forced to. Maybe there's an
Mhm.
argument in which there's like a partial defeat. But at the moment, what they want is not red state autonomy. One of the main things they seem to have been elected to do is send troops into blue cities, right? I don't think they'll settle for anything else. But the
Mhm.
other is that just does seem to be the general trend, both of American institutions, we
Yeah.
see money and power going up, not going down, but also just of American praxis. As a dual
Mhm.
national British UK person, I've been really struck by the way Americans, both politicians and voters, are thinking about politics is in many ways so much more reminiscent of a parliamentary system than a congressional one. People
Mhm.
are increasingly not voting for candidates, they're voting for parties. They're
Yes.
increasingly in a two teams, me versus you thing, which you and Kevin will bemoan, but I just see as the shape of things to come.
Yeah.
And we're behaving as if we have a parliamentary system, but with the institutions of a congressional one. And that kind of explains a lot of our dysfunction, I think. But given that everyone seems to understand politics as national and as about these two teams, and as about two teams which not only reflect your views, but reflect your identity, I don't, I think people like Kevin and what I hear you saying want to say, well, wouldn't it be great if we went back to practicing politics and thinking about politics in this more congressional way, where you have individual candidates and cross-cutting alliances and personal identity isn't so directly staked to party? I don't know, yeah, maybe that would be good. It's not where we are, you know? And I think given where we are, it's going to be top-down control one way or the other, I think.
Yeah. I mean, look, you don't gotta tell a disillusioned Ron Paulite that the world gets more authoritarian. You don't like I am
Centralized, but yes, what
yeah,
most of you mean
like
is the same thing, but
well, yeah, I definitely worry more about the kind of religious liberty decisions and policies towards that end coming from progressives than you seem to have even think have happened. Um, Again, I've got a pretty clear pick between the two.
yeah.
I don't think they're equivalent in any sense. But all this is just to say that, yeah, like my maybe in a similar sort of register to you, my approach might lose. It might be it certainly seems to me the less likely outcome. I think in my gut, I feel like liberalism was the exception. People didn't like it when it stopped getting them what they wanted, and now they're going to throw it out, and we're going to have a really, really bad scene coming up here. I am trying, in light of that, to protect those elements of our current constitutional settlement that I can identify the ones worth protecting and identify the ones, and I don't mean worth protecting morally, I mean worth protecting strategically. Identify the ones worth protecting strategically and identify the ones that are, for whatever reason, too far gone. The demands against them are just too strong. And under those circumstances, how do we realize that in the least harmful and most flourishing, affirming ways? How do we try to get something like people with a greater capacity, state by state, polity by polity, to live according to their comprehensive notion of the good, live according to some view of the good life? That is a high ask. It's probably going to fail, but that is that is my project, and that's what I want to do going forward. I think, and I hope that where I would the consensus I want to end on is I think my project has room for people like you. I think that it needs even people like you going, no, we need to fight rock ribbed all the way, and then your victory depends on how far you can lead your troops. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I'm happy with the, you know, the final note to be, look, we are maybe we, need some from the sort of anti-Trump side, just an overlapping consensus of like we disagree about a lot. And
Mhm.
these are both practical and value philosophic disagreements, right? But we just all need to be united against this fucking thing. I'm fine with that as like an
Mhm.
endpoint, you know?
Yeah, at least for the short to medium term, sounds good to
It's a
me.
bit like that joke about what type of communist are you? And then it's like, okay, we can be friends until after the revolution.
Yeah, it's kind of like once
We're not
once
quite as
the
nuts as
institution,
them,
once the
but
house is not burning down, then we can decide how to decorate it. I understand that logic 100%.
because in many ways, the disagreements we're having are the sorts of disagreements you'd hope would happen under a healthy political system being the main options. You know,
Yeah.
like if the options that were being put before the electorate were, oh, let's have a sort of smaller state, federal, libertarian thing, or
Mhm.
let's have a more progressive, liberal, welfare state thing. If those were our choices, well, I'd
Yeah.
certainly have my side, but that would
Yeah.
be a much better world than the
Yeah.
choices that are currently on offer.
And things are so bad that I have to hope that the two sides smashing against each other can only land on something like what I'm advocating. That stalemate is the only remaining option after they exhaust all of their resources.
So
That's
this is an original thought to me, but I wonder if you're kind of doing what the socialists do, and I wonder if I distrust it for the
heightening the
same reason.
contradictions.
Yeah, maybe things will get so bad that eventually what I want will kind of fall out of it because I've failed to achieve it through any other means. Like,
No, it was more like the way the project started. The was originally the dissertation was called McIntyre's political liberalism, and then I looked at political liberalism like, oh, it can't work. It doesn't got the juice, and so I changed it to McIntyre's modus vivendi. It was I got bartered down to this.
yeah.
That's what this was. I really, in a meaningful sense, did. I again we pick different stories and spectrums of how bad things are
Mm.
and what strategies that badness rules out. People have to look in their hearts and decide how much fear they hold about the situation and whether the proper use of that fear is retrenchment or reconquista, right? Those are that's the open question for any listener listening to this. But the story is pretty similar. I got bartered down to this. I had much higher aspirations as a young gold bug, and
I
those
think
days are gone.
Yeah, what you're looking for is a way to transition us from where we are into that modus vivendi. I just, I think my problem with that, if I want to get it at the clearest, is it's not that we'll give ground and there'll be peace. It's that we'll give ground and then they'll try and take more ground. Like right now, we need to fight and we need
Yeah,
to fight.
it's
That's where I see landing.
and the giving ground thing, the retrenchment is going to be the overall effect, but I think the strategy will play out much more like you will fight. I think you're right. I think there's an appetite for fight on
Yeah.
the left right now, and there's an appetite for fight on the right now, and those will smash against each other. Every side always thinks we're so fractured, and the other side is perfectly hegemonic and top down structured. Like I hear right wingers say that about left wingers all the time. Right wingers are constantly fighting with each other and backbiting the libertarians versus the conservatives versus the integralists versus all these people, and the left is so organized they take their marching orders straight from academia, and I think both those stories are maybe equally wrong to some extent. I think
In
they
in this moment, the right are more hegemonic, surely. I mean, that's a whole other
I'm
conversation.
done fighting about that. I'll put that. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
done arguing about that. So the hope is if those two smash against each other, fatigue sets in around the same time, and we're able to maintain and achieve and maintain something about our current constitutional arrangements, some of the valuable things that still exist under a decentralized pluralistic
Okay,
arrangement.
I can accept that, or at least accept it in this sort of more limited, overlapping consensus sense, where look, we're agreed on fighting Trumpism and we will get to that other debate afterwards. I can agree with that much. I think what worries people like me is that sort of analysis and theory is often used not to say, let's fight, let's smash against each other, and if we end up in a stalemate, that might not be the worst thing in the world. It's used to say, let's give ground. Let's
Yeah,
stop that war.
and I
And
and I see my scholarly work.
that's
Yeah,
why we get riled.
yeah.
That's why we really push back against it, and not unreasonably because those arguments and ideas are often used to justify giving
Yeah.
ground.
And I think, or I certainly hope, I'll put it this way. I think this is in my work, and I think you've inspired me to make it a clearer part of my work.
Yeah,
Um, modus vivendi means fight. Modus vivendi means scrum. Modus vivendi means dispute.
yeah.
It's not going to be a kumbaya overlapping consensus kind of deal. It's gonna be what what my contribution in the work is if we start, here are some signs, here are some kinds of signs of a particular coordination point. If these demands start being satisfied by the right and they chill out a little bit, which you think will never happen, okay, fine. But if these demands are coming from the left and they get satisfied and the left chills out of it, which the right thinks will never happen, okay, fine. But if that starts happening, if we begin to see this modus vivendi form, as I think we already are, as I think we already are seeing the resurgent salience of states and state oriented political contestation as a first step, if that happens, maybe we don't disdain it. Maybe we don't look at this and we go, and this is maybe where some conflict comes back up again. No, 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 we can't accept that deal because that prevents us in our ultimate goal of total hegemonic victory and smashing the fascists and getting the power to deprogram them, as successful as that's going to be. If we start seeing that modus vivendi form, and if it's forming in the way that I lay out, in any kind of relatively morally viable way, then maybe we don't disdain those occurrences as they happen. Maybe we accept them as they happen. Maybe we let Kansas vote in a surprising way and walk away from that argument. I think a lot of people have, and in 2024, I think a lot of people did.
I think we'll get there if and when we get there. And if it's, I mean, and if it's just forced on us, it's forced on us. I don't think it's as likely as I think you do. I think,
Mhm.
and to put it another way, it's not scalable. So, for instance, in the UK, we are a legislative fucking dictatorship. Like,
Mhm.
there's no send it back to the state. I mean, you've maybe got like the Scottish Parliament or something, but there's no
I mean,
regional.
yeah, there's been there's been devolutionary arguments in England over the last 10 years. I think that the institutions aren't as well set up for them, but I think that spirit is there, and if that is the spirit of a moment or is that is the ghost of the times,
Yeah.
is up to be decided.
I just see the US going much more the way of the UK in terms of how it thinks about it. Weirdly, perhaps the UK is going something the other way, but it's starting from a point of very, very nationalized politics.
Mhm.
Anyway, that's a
Yep.
whole other issue. Let's pause. We've both made our points, and we have
Yeah.
appropriately enough for the conversation areas of agreement and areas of identified divergence.
This was really, really fun, man. I had a great time doing this. It's been so long since I've gotten to just talk about. This is such a sad thing for a political theorist to say. It's been so long since I got to talk about politics. Like I've been talking about these kind of high level, Rawlsian, detailed art because you need that's the language of the discipline, right? I was really happy, as the theorists say, to get into it on the object level for a change. Thank you for that. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. And I mean, in some ways, interviewing me, right?
Well, that was the fun part about like this always I was happy it kind of went this way in the sense that I was kind of recruited in to sort of talk neutralist a little bit. And I maybe backed off that a little sooner. I'd kind of like to if we ever did this again, if we ever need to re-up this conversation in 5 years and check on uh
yeah.
our predictions, I would kind of like to put on my Rawls hat and argue a bit more forcefully for that worldview. But yeah, the moment isn't that right now. That's the core area of agreement. One thing you and I can walk away from, we got to throw Rawls under the bus. We do.
Yeah. All right, let's pause it there. Anywhere you'd like to direct listeners to go? Are you getting set up on Blue Sky? Have you
As a matter of fact,
any play or any
yes.
website, anything like
Yes.
that?
I am going to post this very eagerly on my Blue Sky. I'm getting set up over there. You can look at Alec Crisman and you will find that there. That's Crisman. And yeah, I am on the job market, so expect self promotion and thoughts galore.